It was the winter of 1941. Hitler, seated in his command bunker, radiated cold confidence, convinced that Moscow would fall within weeks. The streets of the Soviet capital seemed vulnerable, and his generals assured him that the Russian army was broken, ready to crumble under the might of the Wehrmacht. But behind the icy expanse of forests and frozen rivers, a different reality was unfolding. Temperatures plummeted to nearly unimaginable lows, mud and snow swallowed entire divisions, and the soldiers, exhausted, starving, and frozen, struggled to survive. Meanwhile, the Red Army, battered yet unbroken, was quietly preparing a counterstrike that would catch the Germans off guard and turn the tide of the Eastern Front. In the chilling silence of the Russian winter, thousands of men vanished into the snow, tanks froze where they stood, and Hitler's obsession with victory blinded him to the nightmare closing in around him. This is the story of Operation Typhoon, the desperate battle for Moscow, where ambition, hubris, and the unforgiving winter collided, and where the fate of an empire hung by a thread. By the end of this video, you might just be drifting off to sleep, but before you do, take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of these epic stories, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Operation Typhoon and the battle for Moscow. Chapter 1. The Prelude to Storm, Hitler's Strategic Gamble. In the summer of 1941, Europe was gripped by the largest conflict in human history. Nazi Germany had already swept through Western Europe, leaving France and much of Western Europe under German control, and the world watched with both fear and fascination as Adolf Hitler turned his ambitions toward the vast expanses of the Soviet Union. The early days of Operation Barbarossa had stunned the world. Millions of German soldiers surged eastward in what many believed would be a lightning campaign to crush the Red Army before the onset of winter. For Hitler, the capture of Moscow was not merely a military objective but a symbolic conquest. He believed that the Soviet regime was fragile and that striking at the heart of the Soviet Union would shatter resistance permanently. This conviction was rooted in both ideology and hubris, as Hitler often overestimated the weaknesses of his enemies and underestimated the endurance of the Russian people. The German High Command, while initially supportive of Hitler's vision, harbored serious concerns. Army Group Center had been advancing steadily, but reports of Soviet counterattacks and unexpected logistical challenges were starting to worry some generals. The vastness of the Russian terrain, combined with poor infrastructure and limited supply lines, created an environment where speed alone could not guarantee success. German planners had initially envisioned a rapid encirclement strategy, cutting off Moscow from reinforcements and forcing a collapse of Soviet resistance. However, as summer waned and the forests, rivers, and swampy regions of western Russia slowed their progress, the generals realized that the operation would require more careful preparation than previously anticipated. Meanwhile, the Soviets were far from passive. Despite being caught off guard during the early stages of Barbarossa, the Red Army began to reorganize and reinforce its positions. Stalin, though previously weakened by purges that removed many of his top military leaders, managed to rally the nation. Factories were pressed into service producing weapons, ammunition, and vehicles, while strategic reserves were mobilized to reinforce threatened sectors. Soviet planners understood the importance of Moscow, not just as a political and administrative center, but as a hub of transportation and communications. Losing Moscow would not only be a psychological blow but also disrupt the coordination of the Soviet war effort on multiple fronts. By late summer, the stage was set for what would become Operation Typhoon, the German codename for the offensive aimed at capturing Moscow. Hitler issued his orders with characteristic certainty, envisioning a swift strike that would encircle the Soviet forces defending the capital and crush them before the onset of winter. The operation was to involve massive forces. Army Group Center under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock was to spearhead the assault with support from Panzer Groups 2, 3, and 4. Each Panzer Group, a highly mechanized formation, was designed to punch through Soviet lines with speed and precision, leaving disorganized troops trapped in the rear. Air support would be provided by Luftwaffe 2, which, despite sustaining losses in previous engagements, remained a formidable force capable of striking deep into Soviet territory. The scale of Operation Typhoon was unprecedented. Over 2 million German troops were involved, supported by thousands of tanks, assault guns, and artillery pieces. Supplies were stockpiled along narrow rail lines and roads, and every conceivable measure was taken to ensure that the offensive would have momentum. German planners relied heavily on the concept of blitzkrieg, lightning warfare, believing that speed, surprise, and coordination between infantry, armor, and air power could overwhelm the Soviets before they had a chance to regroup. Yet even as these plans were meticulously laid out, the Germans underestimated the resourcefulness of the Soviet forces and the vast distances they would need to cover, both of which would prove decisive in the coming months. Soviet intelligence had caught some glimpses of German intentions, though the full scale of the threat was not yet clear. Defensive preparations began to take shape. Soldiers dug trenches, constructed anti-tank obstacles, and fortified key transportation hubs. The Soviets adopted a strategy of depth, intending to absorb the initial German assault while preserving reserves to counterattack or reinforce critical positions. Stalin's leadership, harsh and authoritarian, demanded loyalty and perseverance, but it also provided clear direction at a moment when confusion could have been catastrophic. Beyond the military considerations, Operation Typhoon had immense psychological implications. For Hitler, the capture of Moscow would signify the ultimate humiliation of the Soviet Union and a demonstration of German superiority. For the Soviets, the defense of Moscow became a symbol of national survival. Both sides recognized that the battle ahead was more than a contest of arms. It was a clash of wills, a test of endurance and strategy, and an event that would shape the course of World War I. As September approached, both the Germans and Soviets braced for the impending storm. Armies moved into position, supply lines were stretched, and reconnaissance missions scoured the terrain for weaknesses and opportunities. The sense of anticipation was palpable, as each side understood the stakes involved. The coming months would reveal not only the skill and tenacity of military planners and commanders, but also the resilience and courage of ordinary soldiers and civilians who found themselves at the center of one of history's most consequential battles. The stage was fully set. Operation Typhoon, with all its complexity, ambition, and peril, was about to commence. The clash that followed would test the limits of strategy, the endurance of armies, and the resilience of a nation determined not to fall no matter the cost. As September deepened into the Russian fall, the atmosphere across the Eastern Front was tense with expectation. The German forces, stretched across hundreds of miles of countryside, had paused briefly to consolidate gains from their rapid summer advance. Yet every pause brought the looming shadow of winter closer, and each day allowed the Soviets precious time to fortify Moscow's defenses. Hitler, ever impatient, demanded that the offensive begin as soon as possible. His obsession with timing, driven as much by ideology as by military logic, forced Army Group Center to prepare for a massive, all-consuming assault codenamed Operation Typhoon. The Germans believed that with precise coordination, armored breakthroughs, and relentless pressure, Moscow could be encircled and captured before the harsh Russian winter intervened. The planning of Operation Typhoon was meticulous yet ambitious to a fault. Army Group Center, divided into multiple army corps, coordinated an intricate assault plan aimed at enveloping Soviet forces from the north and south. The northern prong would move from Smolensk, pushing through the heavily forested terrain and marshlands, while the southern arm would drive from Bryansk, cutting off retreating Soviet units and encircling them near the approaches to Moscow. The centerpiece of this strategy was speed. Mechanized divisions and panzer units were expected to penetrate deep into Soviet lines, disrupt communications, and destroy key logistical hubs before the Red Army could respond effectively. German intelligence, overconfident after early successes, assumed that Soviet forces would crumble under the weight of this assault. However, the reality of the Eastern Front was more complex. The terrain, riddled with rivers, forests, and muddy plains, hindered mechanized movement. Railroads, the backbone of supply for both sides, were limited in capacity and often sabotaged by retreating Soviet forces. Fuel shortages and overextended supply lines plagued German units, especially as they approached the outskirts of Moscow. German commanders, despite their initial confidence, were forced to confront the challenges posed by a vast, determined enemy and an unforgiving environment. These difficulties were compounded by the resilience of Soviet troops, many of whom fought with desperation, defending villages, forests, and roads with whatever means they had available. On the Soviet side, Moscow had become the symbolic and practical center of resistance. Stalin, aware that the fate of the capital would have profound political and psychological consequences, directed an extensive mobilization of the city's population. Factories that once produced consumer goods were converted into weapons factories. Civilians dug trenches, constructed barricades, and fortified key buildings, all while the Red Army prepared layered defensive lines to absorb and blunt the German assault. Soviet leadership, having learned from previous mistakes, positioned reserves strategically, ready to plug breaches or launch counterattacks as needed. Political commissars ensured that morale remained high, emphasizing the defense of the homeland as a sacred duty. As the German assault drew near, the psychological impact on both sides was immense. For German soldiers, the promise of a decisive victory over Moscow was intoxicating. Yet the extended supply lines and reports of Soviet resilience sowed unease. On the Soviet side, the knowledge that the enemy was advancing with overwhelming force instilled both fear and determination. Ordinary civilians, soldiers, and leaders alike understood that the coming battle would demand sacrifices of unprecedented scale. Every mile closer to Moscow intensified the stakes, making clear that failure was not merely a setback but a catastrophe that could alter the course of the war. The Luftwaffe played a critical role in the planning and execution of Typhoon. Despite having been engaged heavily throughout the summer, German air forces were tasked with establishing air superiority, supporting ground operations, and targeting Soviet logistics and communications. The planes were expected to disrupt troop movements, destroy rail lines, and provide reconnaissance that would guide armored thrusts. Yet Soviet anti-aircraft defenses and rapidly mobilized fighters posed significant challenges, foreshadowing the fierce aerial engagements that would accompany the ground battles. Air support, though potentially decisive, could not overcome the sheer expanse of terrain and the unpredictability of weather, both of which would complicate German efforts. Meanwhile, intelligence reports filtered through the German high command, often inconsistent or overly optimistic, added tension to the planning process. Some commanders warned of Soviet reserves being concentrated near Moscow, while others underestimated the Red Army's capacity to regroup and fortify positions. Hitler's own impatience amplified these concerns. His insistence on speed left little room for careful deliberation or adaptation, forcing commanders to rely on audacious maneuvers and the belief that momentum alone would secure victory. As Operation Typhoon approached its commencement, the Eastern Front became a theater of anticipation. Supply convoys rumbled along dirt roads, soldiers sharpened their skills in preparation for the coming clash, and reconnaissance units probed Soviet defenses, mapping terrain and potential weaknesses. On the Soviet side, citizens and soldiers alike worked tirelessly to prepare the capital, digging trenches, stockpiling ammunition, and erecting defensive obstacles. Moscow itself became a symbol of defiance, its survival intertwined with the morale of an entire nation. In these final days before the offensive, the contrast between the German and Soviet approaches was stark. The Germans relied on mechanized power, speed, and psychological shock, believing in a rapid collapse of resistance. The Soviets, conversely, embraced endurance, fortification, and a strategic depth designed to wear down the invaders and exploit their overconfidence. The collision of these philosophies was imminent, promising a battle that would test every facet of military skill, human endurance, and national resolve. Thus, the prelude to Operation Typhoon set the stage for one of the most dramatic and consequential battles of the Second World War. The ambitions of Hitler, the resilience of Stalin's forces, the endurance of ordinary soldiers, and the strategic importance of Moscow converged to create a maelstrom of conflict that would define the Eastern Front. The months that followed would reveal the full scale of the German gamble, the capacity of the Soviet Union to resist, and the profound consequences for the course of the war. Operation Typhoon was not merely an attack. It was a confrontation between ideology, strategy, and the indomitable will of a nation defending its heart. Chapter 2. The Wehrmacht advances. Planning the strike on Moscow, as September of 1941 unfolded across the Eastern Front, the German Wehrmacht found itself at a critical juncture. The initial months of Operation Barbarossa had delivered stunning territorial gains, yet the campaign had revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of Hitler's strategy. Army Group Center, which had carved a swath through Belarus and approached the outskirts of Moscow, faced increasingly complex challenges. The speed that had characterized the early blitzkrieg was slowing, hampered by extended supply lines, the vast distances of Russian territory, and the resilient defenses of the Red Army. Despite these obstacles, the German High Command remained convinced that a decisive strike against Moscow could determine the fate of the entire Eastern Front. The planning for the assault on Moscow, codified as Operation Typhoon, involved meticulous coordination among multiple Army Corps, panzer divisions, and air support units. Hitler and his generals envisioned a dual-pronged attack designed to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces defending the capital. The northern prong was to advance from Smolensk, cutting through heavily forested regions while capturing key transportation hubs, while the southern arm, advancing from Bryansk, aimed to trap retreating Soviet units and prevent reinforcement. Between these two axes, a sweeping envelopment would theoretically collapse the Soviet defensive perimeter and open a direct path to Moscow. The German planners relied heavily on mechanized mobility, coordination between infantry and armor, and precise logistical support to achieve this ambitious objective. At the center of the offensive, Panzer Groups 2, 3, and 4 were tasked with leading the breakthroughs. These armored units were the backbone of Germany's military doctrine, embodying the principles of blitzkrieg: speed, surprise, and the integration of combined arms. Tanks were to spearhead attacks through weak points in Soviet defenses, followed closely by motorized infantry who could secure captured positions and protect flanks. Artillery units would provide constant bombardment to disrupt enemy formations, while the Luftwaffe would suppress air resistance, destroy supply lines, and offer reconnaissance to guide armored movements. The coordination required was immense, and any misstep could jeopardize the entire operation. Despite their confidence, German commanders faced logistical nightmares. The further the Wehrmacht advanced, the more tenuous their supply lines became. Fuel, food, ammunition, and replacement parts had to traverse hundreds of kilometers over poorly maintained roads and limited rail infrastructure. Russian rivers, marshes, and dense forests slowed mechanized divisions, and the onset of autumn rains, the infamous Rasputitsa, turned roads into quagmires. Commanders frequently reported delays and supply shortages, and some units risked stalling before reaching critical positions. Yet Hitler, impatient and convinced of the enemy's imminent collapse, insisted on maintaining momentum. His directive left generals little room for tactical flexibility, forcing them to execute operations under extreme pressure and often at great risk. The intelligence situation added another layer of complexity. German reconnaissance had provided maps, reports, and aerial photographs, yet much of this information underestimated the Soviets' capacity for mobilization and fortification. Soviet reserves, though depleted in the summer campaigns, were being repositioned strategically to defend Moscow. The Red Army employed a combination of deception, deliberate retreats, and fortified strongpoints to channel the Wehrmacht into kill zones. Anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and trenches were laid in critical areas, slowing the German advance and inflicting casualties that, though initially manageable, accumulated over time. German planners assumed that Soviet resistance would crumble under pressure, but the reality of the Eastern Front was proving far more resilient than anticipated. Coordination between the Wehrmacht's various elements presented another challenge. Infantry, armor, and artillery often moved at different paces, and maintaining communication over vast distances was difficult, especially in the dense forests and marshes that characterized much of Western Russia. The Luftwaffe's operations, though critical for reconnaissance and close air support, could not entirely prevent Soviet counterattacks or protect supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers. German commanders often had to make decisions with incomplete information, relying on rapid judgment under conditions of uncertainty. These factors combined to make the planning and execution of Typhoon a delicate balance between ambition and risk. The political dimension of the operation further complicated matters. Hitler saw Moscow not only as a military objective but as the ideological heart of Soviet power. Capturing the city would strike a symbolic blow to the Soviet regime, undermining morale and potentially triggering a collapse of resistance across the Eastern Front. This ideological framing increased pressure on commanders to achieve swift results, even when practical considerations suggested caution. For German officers, this meant that operational planning was inseparable from political expectations, and failure could have consequences far beyond the battlefield. Soviet intelligence, meanwhile, had detected signs of the impending German offensive. Moscow itself became a fortress in preparation for Typhoon. Civilians were mobilized alongside soldiers to reinforce defensive positions, build trenches, and erect barricades. Factories were redirected to produce weapons, ammunition, and other supplies essential for the defense of the capital. Red Army leadership established multiple defensive layers, intended to absorb initial attacks and buy time for counteroffensives. The Soviet strategy relied not merely on immediate resistance but on endurance and strategic depth, exploiting the Germans' overextension as the campaign progressed. As German units advanced in early autumn, the contrast between the two sides' approaches became increasingly evident. The Wehrmacht relied on speed, mobility, and psychological shock, aiming for decisive breakthroughs. The Soviets, conversely, emphasized resilience, depth, and attrition, turning the vast terrain and environmental challenges into tools of defense. Every village defended, every road blocked, and every river crossing contested was a reminder that the path to Moscow would not be simple. Both sides understood that the battle ahead would test not only military skill but endurance, strategy, and human will. The preparations for Typhoon, stretching across hundreds of miles of territory, marked a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. Germany's most ambitious operation since the invasion of the Soviet Union was about to begin, combining enormous forces, intricate coordination, and immense stakes. Hitler's strategic gamble, driven by confidence and ideological conviction, faced the ultimate test against a nation determined to defend its capital at all costs. The Wehrmacht's advance toward Moscow set the stage for one of the most dramatic and consequential battles of World War II, where strategy, environment, logistics, and the resilience of millions would collide in a defining confrontation. By mid-September 1941, the German Wehrmacht's advance toward Moscow had begun in earnest. The soldiers who had surged across Western Russia during the summer now faced new challenges. The initial exhilaration of rapid victories gave way to the grueling realities of extended campaigns, stretched supply lines, and a resolute enemy. The Wehrmacht moved through terrain that was unforgiving. Dense forests, swampy plains, and a patchwork of rivers and lakes complicated the maneuvering of mechanized units. Every kilometer forward demanded careful coordination, yet Hitler's insistence on speed placed enormous pressure on the commanders and men in the field. Operation Typhoon was a race against time, an ambitious gamble to capture Moscow before the onset of winter, and the stakes could not have been higher. Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was tasked with leading the northern and central thrusts toward Moscow. Each panzer group, Groups 2, 3, and 4, was expected to spearhead breakthroughs in the Soviet defensive lines. These armored divisions were supported by motorized infantry, artillery, and Luftwaffe air units, forming a complex, integrated fighting force designed to move rapidly and exploit weaknesses. German planners relied on the doctrine of combined arms, where tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft worked in unison to achieve decisive results. Yet, despite the theory, the execution in the field faced persistent difficulties. Tanks became bogged down in muddy roads, infantry struggled to keep pace, and supply trucks were delayed by damaged infrastructure and ambushes along the routes. The Soviet defenses, although initially taken by surprise during the early months of Barbarossa, had reorganized with remarkable speed. Red Army units had been repositioned to protect Moscow, and multiple defensive layers had been constructed to absorb the German offensive. Trenches, anti-tank ditches, and fortified villages slowed the advance and inflicted casualties that began to erode German momentum. Soviet artillery and machine gun nests dominated key roads and choke points, making every kilometer of progress hard-won. In addition, Stalin's order to mobilize civilians in support of the defense created a unique form of resistance. Workers, students, and ordinary citizens were involved in digging defensive positions, erecting obstacles, and maintaining critical infrastructure, making the city itself a living fortress. Logistics emerged as one of the most pressing challenges for the Wehrmacht. Fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts had to traverse hundreds of kilometers of poorly maintained roads, often over terrain that could not support heavy vehicles. As the German columns pressed east, supply lines stretched thin, and any disruption, whether from partisan attacks, weather, or Soviet countermeasures, risked stalling the advance. Commanders frequently reported shortages of essential supplies, forcing improvisation and adaptation. The operational plan had assumed that speed would mitigate these logistical concerns, but the reality was far more complex. Delays were inevitable, and each day allowed Soviet forces more time to prepare and reinforce positions. The Luftwaffe was charged with supporting the advance, but its role was not without complications. Air superiority was critical to the success of Operation Typhoon, and the Germans sought to disrupt Soviet communications, destroy rail lines, and provide reconnaissance for the armored thrusts. Yet the Luftwaffe faced logistical constraints of its own. Planes required fuel, maintenance, and munitions, all of which had to be transported along the same overextended supply lines as the ground units. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses and fighter planes contested the skies, forcing German pilots to operate under constant threat. Despite these challenges, Luftwaffe support remained a vital component, enabling breakthroughs in some sectors and providing valuable intelligence for the commanders on the ground. German intelligence had painted an incomplete picture of Soviet strength. Reports often underestimated the scale and resilience of Soviet reserves near Moscow. The Wehrmacht assumed that Soviet troops would crumble under pressure, but the Red Army had already begun strategic withdrawals designed to lure the Germans into traps and overextend their forces. Counterattacks, ambushes, and defensive strongpoints slowed the German advance and imposed mounting casualties. Each engagement, though often small in scale compared to the entire front, contributed to a cumulative attrition that would ultimately test the limits of the German operational plan. The psychological dimension of the campaign was equally significant. German soldiers were imbued with the expectation of rapid victory, but the grueling marches, muddy terrain, and unexpected resistance began to strain morale. On the Soviet side, the defense of Moscow became a unifying cause, inspiring both soldiers and civilians. Every village defended, every road blocked, and every river crossing contested represented a collective effort to halt the invaders. The sense of urgency was palpable, as Moscow's survival was intertwined with the fate of the nation itself. As September gave way to October, the pace of the German advance began to show signs of slowing. While panzer units still achieved localized successes, the depth of Soviet defenses and the logistical challenges of operating hundreds of kilometers from supply bases made it increasingly difficult to maintain momentum. Each day brought new obstacles, from flooded roads to reinforced Soviet positions, highlighting the limitations of even the most sophisticated military machinery in the face of a determined opponent and a vast, unforgiving landscape. Hitler's strategic gamble, the core of Operation Typhoon, now hung in a delicate balance. The Wehrmacht had advanced deep into Soviet territory, but the fall of Moscow was far from assured. Both sides understood that the coming months would not only test military skill but also endurance, adaptability, and the will to persevere under extreme conditions. The stage was set for one of the most decisive confrontations of World War II, where the clash of strategy, human determination, and the unforgiving realities of the Eastern Front would define the outcome of the campaign. The German advance toward Moscow illustrated both the brilliance and the hubris of the Wehrmacht. The meticulous planning, integration of armored, infantry, and air forces, and ambition for decisive victory were tempered by the harsh realities of logistics, terrain, weather, and a determined adversary. As the armies pressed forward, the collision of these forces created a tension that would erupt in the battles to come, marking a defining moment in the struggle for the Eastern Front. Operation Typhoon was no longer just a strategic operation. It was a test of endurance, ingenuity, and the limits of human resilience in the face of one of history's most ambitious military campaigns. Chapter 3: Soviet Defenses and the Struggle to Hold the Capital. By the autumn of 1941, the approach of German forces toward Moscow had transformed the city from a political center into a fortress. The stakes were monumental. Moscow was not only the administrative heart of the Soviet Union, but also a crucial transportation hub, linking the western and eastern regions of the country. Its loss would have been a devastating blow to Soviet morale and operational capacity. Recognizing the enormity of the threat, Stalin and his military planners undertook one of the most ambitious defensive preparations in modern history. The Soviet strategy combined military organization, civilian mobilization, and meticulous urban fortification, creating a multi-layered defense designed to absorb the German offensive, delay their advance, and preserve vital resources for counterattacks. Moscow's fortifications were extensive and sophisticated, reflecting lessons learned from both history and early setbacks during Operation Barbarossa. The city was ringed with a series of defensive belts, consisting of trenches, barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and fortified villages. These layers were designed to slow and disrupt the German advance, forcing the Wehrmacht to expend time, manpower, and equipment on overcoming obstacles that were deliberately scattered across strategic locations. Every village along the approach to Moscow became a potential strongpoint, defended by both Red Army troops and local militia. Forests and swamps were used as natural barriers, channeling mechanized columns into kill zones where artillery and small arms could be most effective. The Soviet military structure itself had undergone rapid reorganization in the months following the initial German invasion. Despite the chaos and purges that had weakened the Red Army, new commanders and staff officers rose to the occasion, implementing defensive strategies that maximized the strengths of available forces. Infantry divisions were positioned to defend key roads, railways, and river crossings, while armored units were held in reserve for counterattacks. Artillery placements, carefully sited to dominate approaches and natural choke points, could inflict severe damage on concentrated German columns. Coordination between different branches of the Red Army was challenging, but the urgency of defending the capital demanded rapid adaptation and improvisation. Civilians played an essential role in the defense of Moscow, transforming the city into a living fortress. Millions were mobilized to dig trenches, erect barricades, and reinforce existing structures. Schools, factories, and public buildings were repurposed as defensive positions, hospitals, or logistical hubs. Volunteers participated in moving supplies, constructing obstacles, and maintaining critical infrastructure under the constant threat of air raids and artillery bombardment. The psychological impact of this mobilization was profound. It reinforced the idea that every citizen had a role in defending the homeland, and the defense of Moscow became a national cause, binding military and civilian efforts together in an unprecedented display of collective resilience. The Red Army also implemented a strategy of depth in its defensive planning. Instead of relying solely on frontline resistance, Soviet planners established successive layers of defense that could absorb initial attacks and gradually wear down the German forces. Each layer was designed to buy time, disrupt enemy supply lines, and create opportunities for counterattacks. This approach relied heavily on the ability to quickly reinforce threatened sectors, which required efficient communication, rapid movement of reserves, and coordinated command structures. It was a complex operation that demanded discipline, adaptability, and a keen understanding of both terrain and enemy capabilities. Intelligence and reconnaissance were vital to Soviet preparations. Scouts, spies, and local informants provided information on German troop movements, supply lines, and likely points of attack. This intelligence allowed commanders to deploy forces more effectively, anticipate potential breakthroughs, and prepare contingency plans. At the same time, the Soviets implemented a series of deceptive measures to mislead the German advance. Dummy positions, fake artillery emplacements, and false supply depots were used to confuse reconnaissance efforts, divert attacks, and create the illusion of strength in areas that were more lightly defended. The psychological dimension of defending Moscow was immense. Soldiers understood the symbolic and strategic importance of the city, and this awareness fueled extraordinary determination. For civilians, the sense of impending invasion brought both fear and resolve. The Soviet leadership emphasized the moral imperative of defense, portraying the battle as a struggle not only for territory but for the survival of the nation itself. Propaganda, speeches, and visible mobilization reinforced this narrative, creating a powerful collective will to resist the German advance at all costs. German forces, by contrast, were confronted with the growing difficulty of penetrating these layered defenses. Despite numerical superiority and technological advantages in armor and artillery, the Wehrmacht found itself slowed by fortified positions, ambushes, and the deliberate destruction of bridges and roads by retreating Soviet units. Each kilometer forward was contested, and every village defended imposed delays and casualties that, while individually small, accumulated into a significant operational burden. The Germans were beginning to confront the reality that capturing Moscow would not be a simple matter of speed and firepower. It would require sustained effort against an enemy who was resourceful, determined, and operating on home territory. Weather, too, began to play a role. While the full harshness of the Russian winter had not yet arrived, autumn rains created muddy, treacherous conditions that slowed mechanized units and complicated supply efforts. German commanders recognized the urgency of their advance but were increasingly aware that every delay allowed Soviet reinforcements to arrive and fortifications to be strengthened. The clock was ticking, and the Wehrmacht's window of opportunity was narrowing with each passing day. Thus, the struggle to defend Moscow in the autumn of 1941 was a multidimensional effort, combining military ingenuity, civilian mobilization, intelligence, and psychological resilience. The Soviet approach emphasized endurance, depth, and strategic coordination, countering the German doctrine of speed, shock, and mechanized breakthroughs. As both sides prepared for the decisive battles ahead, it became clear that the fight for Moscow would test not only armies and equipment, but also the will, creativity, and endurance of all involved. Operation Typhoon was no longer simply a campaign plan. It had become a clash between determination and ambition, a confrontation that would define the fate of one of history's greatest cities and the course of World War II. As the German advance pressed deeper into Russian territory, the Soviets intensified their preparations around Moscow, fully aware that the city's survival was intertwined with the fate of the nation. The Red Army, learning from the devastating early months of Barbarossa, emphasized strategic depth, flexibility, and the ability to absorb initial blows while preparing for counterattacks. Each district around Moscow was treated as a potential battlefield, with fortifications built to delay, confuse, and attrit the German forces. Villages were transformed into strong points, forests became ambush zones, and river crossings were heavily defended. This approach reflected a calculated understanding that the German army, despite its speed and firepower, was vulnerable to overextension and attrition. Particularly in unfamiliar territory, civilians played a role as critical as the soldiers. Men and women, young and old, were mobilized to support the defense effort. They dug trenches, laid barbed wire, reinforced key buildings, and prepared supply caches for both troops and the population. Factories were converted to produce weapons, ammunition, and other essential military supplies, turning the industrial capacity of Moscow into a frontline resource. Schools, theaters, and warehouses were converted into barracks, hospitals, and command posts. This mobilization blurred the line between civilian and soldier, creating a population actively engaged in the survival of their city. The morale impact of this widespread participation cannot be overstated. Citizens understood that their actions directly affected the ability of the Red Army to resist the German onslaught, and this collective determination infused the defenders with resilience that would prove crucial in the months ahead. The Soviet command structure worked tirelessly to integrate intelligence, reconnaissance, and operational planning into the broader defense strategy. Reconnaissance units monitored German movements and reported on troop concentrations, vehicle convoys, and potential attack routes. Local partisan activity, while limited at this stage, supplemented these efforts by disrupting German communications and supply lines. The information gathered was used to adjust troop deployments, reinforce vulnerable sectors, and prepare traps for advancing German units. In essence, the Soviets transformed Moscow and its surrounding areas into a highly dynamic and responsive defensive system, capable of absorbing attacks and countering weaknesses almost in real-time. One of the most innovative aspects of the Soviet defensive effort was the creation of multiple fallback positions and reserve lines. Commanders did not expect that frontline units could hold indefinitely against the Wehrmacht's superior armor and firepower. Instead, they planned for controlled withdrawals, designed to draw German forces into areas where artillery, infantry, and tank reserves could strike decisively. This elastic defense strategy exploited the overconfidence of the German army, which expected rapid breakthroughs and decisive victories, and turned the vast Russian terrain into an ally. Forests, rivers, and swampy areas became natural defensive barriers, while man-made fortifications channeled attackers into predictable paths where they could be targeted effectively. Meanwhile, the Germans, advancing under Operation Typhoon, began to realize the challenges that the Soviets' defensive preparations posed. Each village and forested area contested slowed their advance, forcing them to commit additional resources and exposing supply lines to sabotage and ambush. German armored units, which had previously rolled across the open fields of Belarus with relative ease, now faced mud, rivers, and fortified Soviet positions that reduced their mobility and effectiveness. The Wehrmacht's reliance on rapid, coordinated maneuvers was increasingly hampered by terrain and the resilient Soviet defense, highlighting the limits of even the most formidable military machine when confronted with determined, adaptive opposition. The psychological aspect of the struggle was profound on both sides. For the German soldiers, the initial excitement of rapid victories was tempered by exhaustion, constant skirmishes, and the realization that Moscow would not fall easily. Casualties, harsh terrain, and logistical difficulties eroded morale, even as Hitler's insistence on speed placed immense pressure on commanders to maintain momentum. On the Soviet side, the combined effort of civilians and soldiers reinforced a sense of purpose and inevitability. Defending Moscow was more than a military objective. It was a national duty, a test of endurance and loyalty that inspired extraordinary commitment. Propaganda, speeches, and visible demonstrations of unity strengthened the resolve of the populace, ensuring that both the defenders and the city itself would not succumb without a prolonged struggle. Weather began to play a subtle but significant role in shaping the conflict. While the deep winter had yet to arrive, autumn rains turned roads into quagmires, slowing trucks, tanks, and artillery movements. Rivers swelled, marshes became impassable, and the first frosts hinted at the coming challenges that would further complicate the German advance. These conditions, combined with Soviet defensive ingenuity, began to level the playing field, allowing even lightly equipped units to resist the highly mechanized Wehrmacht. Every day of delay favored the Soviets, giving them additional time to reinforce positions, reposition troops, and prepare for the eventual winter campaigns that would become infamous in the battles around Moscow. As October progressed, the struggle to hold Moscow became increasingly intense. Soviet defenses, already extensive, were continuously reinforced with new troops, supplies, and fortifications. Artillery and machine gun nests were placed strategically to cover roadways, bridges, and key junctions, while mobile reserve units remained poised to counter German breakthroughs. Civilians continued to contribute, reinforcing positions, transporting supplies, and maintaining essential infrastructure under difficult conditions. The integration of military and civilian efforts created a multi-layered, resilient defense network that challenged the German doctrine of rapid, decisive victories. The months-long preparation, combined with the resilience of the Red Army and the involvement of civilians, meant that Operation Typhoon would confront a reality far different from the rapid conquests of summer. Moscow was not merely a target. It was a fortress, a symbol of national endurance, and a testing ground for the limits of both human and military capability. The Germans faced a city prepared for protracted defense, a population committed to survival, and a military that had adapted to the challenges of the Eastern Front with remarkable speed. The coming battles would reveal whether German strategic ambition could overcome Soviet resilience, or whether the defense of Moscow would mark the beginning of a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. Chapter 4. The Battles of Vyazma and Bryansk. Encirclement and Chaos. As October of 1941 progressed, the Wehrmacht's advance toward Moscow encountered its first truly formidable operational challenge. The battles around Vyazma and Bryansk, often overshadowed by the larger narrative of Operation Typhoon, were among the most critical engagements of the autumn campaign. These battles exemplified the German strategy of encirclement, the Red Army's resilience, and the chaos that could emerge when millions of soldiers collided across vast, difficult terrain. The fighting was marked by rapid advances, desperate counterattacks, and a relentless struggle to control the movement of men, tanks, and artillery through forests, rivers, and villages. Vyazma, situated approximately 200 kilometers west of Moscow, became a focal point in the German operational plan. Army Group Center aimed to envelop Soviet forces positioned in this sector, cutting them off from reinforcements and retreat routes. German planners relied heavily on mechanized units to encircle large formations, using speed and coordination to trap enemy forces in pockets where artillery and air power could inflict maximum damage. Panzer divisions pushed forward along roads and through gaps in the Soviet lines, while motorized infantry secured captured positions and closed the encirclement. The objective was not merely territorial gain but the destruction of Soviet forces, which the Germans believed would clear the path to Moscow. The Soviet defenders, however, were far from passive. The Red Army, despite suffering heavy losses earlier in the campaign, displayed remarkable adaptability. Infantry units dug into forests, fortified villages, and prepared ambushes along roads used by German armored columns. Artillery units were positioned to dominate choke points and disrupt German communications and supply lines. Reserves were held strategically to plug gaps in the defense or launch local counterattacks, creating uncertainty for German commanders who relied on predictable breakthroughs. Every advance forced the Wehrmacht to adapt in real time, and every delay compounded the logistical strain on their long supply lines. The human dimension of the battles around Vyazma was immense. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were involved, and the fighting quickly escalated into large-scale encirclements that trapped units on both sides. Casualties were heavy, and the sheer intensity of combat created chaotic conditions that challenged even experienced commanders. Soviet units, facing the risk of annihilation, fought with extraordinary determination. In many cases, entire battalions and divisions were surrounded but refused to surrender, instead attempting breakout operations under constant artillery and aerial bombardment. The Germans, on the other hand, had to balance the desire for rapid encirclement with the risk of overextending their own lines, a challenge that would continue to plague them as the offensive pressed closer to Moscow. Bryansk, further south, presented a parallel and equally complex set of operations. Army Group Center sought to envelop Soviet forces in this sector to prevent them from reinforcing the northern defenses near Vyazma or retreating toward Moscow. German planners coordinated infantry, armored, and artillery units to create a pincer movement that would trap Soviet formations in the dense forests and river valleys. Here again, the combination of speed, mechanized mobility, and concentrated firepower was central to German doctrine. Yet the Soviets employed defensive depth, strategic withdrawals, and counterattacks to slow the German advance, inflicting significant casualties while maintaining the cohesion of their forces. The environmental and logistical challenges of these battles cannot be overstated. The autumn rains turned roads into mud, rivers swelled, and forests complicated maneuvering. Panzer divisions found themselves bogged down, forced to wait for engineers to repair bridges or clear obstacles. Infantry and artillery units struggled to maintain pace, while supply trucks became vulnerable to both the terrain and Soviet sabotage. The Germans' reliance on rapid mechanized movement was increasingly tested, demonstrating that even the most advanced military formations were not immune to the constraints of geography and weather. Air support played a critical but limited role in these engagements. The Luftwaffe conducted reconnaissance missions, targeted Soviet supply lines, and attempted to provide close support to armored advances. Yet the vastness of the terrain, the dispersed nature of the fighting, and the resilience of Soviet anti-aircraft defenses limited the effectiveness of German air power. Soviet fighters contested the skies, and anti-aircraft positions along key roads and supply hubs made air operations hazardous. While the Luftwaffe contributed to localized successes, it could not entirely mitigate the challenges posed by the defensive depth, terrain, and determination of Soviet forces. The battles of Vyazma and Bryansk also highlighted the broader operational and strategic implications of Operation Typhoon. The German strategy relied on swift encirclement to achieve decisive victories, yet the scale of the Soviet forces, the complexity of the terrain, and the ability of the Red Army to adapt created conditions where encirclements were contested and costly. German casualties mounted, and units that were expected to be combat effective for the advance on Moscow increasingly faced exhaustion, logistical strain, and the psychological toll of prolonged combat. Every delay at Vyazma or Bryansk reverberated along the German front, threatening to disrupt the timetable of the entire operation and providing the Soviets with invaluable time to reinforce the capital. The human cost of these battles was staggering. Both sides suffered tens of thousands of casualties, with soldiers enduring constant artillery fire, close-quarters combat, and the relentless pressure of maneuver warfare. Encircled Soviet units faced the grim choice of attempting dangerous breakouts or fighting to the last man. German soldiers, while initially confident, were forced to confront the limits of their doctrine and the unpredictability of large-scale operations across vast, contested terrain. Civilians in the surrounding areas were caught in the crossfire, facing displacement, shortages, and the terror of living near active combat zones. Ultimately, the battles of Vyazma and Bryansk exemplified the challenges of executing Operation Typhoon. They demonstrated that the German strategy of rapid encirclement, while effective in smaller engagements, faced significant limitations when applied across hundreds of kilometers of defended territory against a resilient and adaptive opponent. For the Soviets, these engagements provided a critical opportunity to delay the German advance, preserve forces, and prepare the defenses of Moscow. The chaos, encirclement, and fierce resistance of these battles set the stage for the grueling struggle that would soon envelop the approaches to the Soviet capital. The aftermath of the battles of Vyazma and Bryansk revealed both the effectiveness and limitations of German operational planning. While the Wehrmacht succeeded in encircling large portions of Soviet forces, the cost in manpower, equipment, and time was far higher than anticipated. Tens of thousands of Red Army soldiers were captured, killed, or dispersed, yet significant numbers managed to break through or evade the encirclement entirely, preserving their cohesion and combat potential. These remnants would later regroup to reinforce Moscow's defenses, demonstrating that even a near-catastrophic defeat could be transformed into strategic resilience under determined leadership. German commanders, initially confident in the success of encirclement tactics, began to face the practical consequences of extended supply lines and exhausted units. The panzer divisions, the spearheads of the offensive, had advanced hundreds of kilometers through challenging terrain, but their momentum slowed as they reached the outer approaches to Moscow. Fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and attrition from sustained skirmishes reduced the operational capacity of armored units. Infantry divisions, stretched thin over broad fronts, struggled to maintain control over occupied territory and secure lines of communication. The Wehrmacht's logistical system, already under strain, was now operating at the limits of its efficiency, foreshadowing the difficulties that would intensify as the offensive approached the capital. The Soviets, despite heavy losses, adapted quickly to the evolving situation. Encirclement battles had taught commanders critical lessons about the mobility of German forces and the vulnerabilities of overextended supply lines. Units that had escaped Vyazma and Bryansk were immediately redeployed to bolster the defensive belts around Moscow. These survivors brought valuable combat experience and a hardened resolve, becoming central to the city's layered defense system. Red Army leadership emphasized the importance of tactical withdrawal and regrouping, ensuring that even after tactical setbacks, forces could contribute meaningfully to the larger strategic objective, the defense of Moscow. Civilian mobilization intensified in response to the proximity of German forces. Moscow, now clearly under threat, became a city fully engaged in its own survival. Barricades were strengthened, trenches deepened, and supply caches strategically placed to support both military personnel and civilians. Factories ramped up production, converting raw materials into munitions, artillery shells, and other essential resources. Volunteers worked in convoys transporting these supplies to the front, often under threat of aerial bombardment. The intertwining of civilian and military efforts created a dynamic and flexible defense network, capable of responding rapidly to German incursions while maintaining essential city functions. As German forces advanced from Vyazma and Bryansk, they encountered a new set of challenges. The sheer scale of the operations required coordination across hundreds of kilometers, with communication lines constantly disrupted by both terrain and Soviet interference. Forests and rivers funneled movements into predictable paths, which the Soviets exploited with artillery, ambushes, and minefields. Every engagement, though often localized, added cumulative delays that disrupted the carefully timed German plan for Operation Typhoon. Even elite units, accustomed to rapid advances and decisive victories, struggled to maintain cohesion under continuous skirmishes and logistical strain. The Luftwaffe, while still a formidable force, was increasingly stretched. German aircraft attempted to provide reconnaissance, air cover, and support for ground operations, but the dispersed nature of combat and the resilient Soviet air defenses limited effectiveness. Fighters engaged in constant dogfights with Soviet aircraft, while bombers faced anti-aircraft fire and adverse weather conditions. The inability to achieve complete air superiority meant that German ground forces could not rely entirely on aerial reconnaissance or support, further complicating the advance toward Moscow. Strategically, the encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk had both immediate and long-term consequences. In the short term, the Germans eliminated large pockets of Soviet resistance, creating openings for continued advances toward the capital. However, the losses, logistical strain, and delays provided the Soviets with invaluable time to strengthen the outer defensive belts of Moscow. The surviving Red Army units, reinforced by fresh recruits and volunteers, formed the backbone of a resilient defensive network that would soon confront the Wehrmacht in some of the most intense urban and field battles of the war. Psychologically, the outcomes of these battles were complex. German troops experienced a mix of triumph and fatigue, victories shadowed by the realization that their advance was not as uncontested as initially imagined. Soldiers confronted continuous resistance, environmental challenges, and extended operations far from supply bases. For the Soviets, the partial encirclements were devastating, yet they also reinforced the capacity for adaptation and survival. The lessons learned from Vyazma and Bryansk informed subsequent deployments and tactics, enabling a more cohesive and determined defense around Moscow. The broader operational picture revealed the limits of blitzkrieg when applied across vast distances and against an adaptive opponent. While German forces had demonstrated tactical brilliance in maneuvering and encirclement, the cumulative effects of overextension, attrition, and resilient opposition foreshadowed the difficulties of capturing Moscow. For the Red Army, the battles provided a crucible in which surviving units gained experience, coordination, and determination. These elements would be crucial as the Wehrmacht approached the capital, setting the stage for the monumental struggle that would define Operation Typhoon and the winter campaign to follow. And the final analysis, Vyazma and Bryansk illustrated the dual nature of Operation Typhoon. Tactical success tempered by operational strain and strategic uncertainty. The Wehrmacht's encirclement tactics achieved immediate objectives but exposed vulnerabilities that would complicate the drive toward Moscow. The Soviet ability to adapt, reinforce, and mobilize civilians ensured that even after severe losses, Moscow's defenses would be formidable. The stage was now set for the climactic confrontations around the approaches to the Soviet capital, where the collision of strategy, endurance, and determination would reach unprecedented intensity. Chapter 5. The Siege of Moscow begins. City under threat. By late October 1941, the thunder of German artillery and the distant drone of aircraft became part of Moscow's daily soundscape. The city, once a bustling center of politics, industry, and culture, now resembled an armed camp bracing for the storm. Operation Typhoon had brought the Wehrmacht to the very outskirts of the Soviet capital. This moment was unlike anything the citizens had experienced before. An uneasy mix of fear, defiance, and a grim sense of purpose. The Soviet leadership knew that the fall of Moscow could trigger a cascade of catastrophic effects. The loss of the political heart of the USSR, the collapse of its transportation hub, and perhaps even the fracturing of morale across the vast Soviet Union. For Hitler, Moscow represented not only a strategic target but also a symbolic one, the jewel in the crown of his eastern conquest. The siege that was about to unfold would test the endurance, ingenuity, and willpower of both nations to the utmost. The Soviet High Command under Stalin had spent the preceding months transforming Moscow into a fortress. The defensive belts established around the city were among the most elaborate in modern history. A dense web of trenches, tank traps, barbed wire, and fortified strongpoints stretching for hundreds of kilometers. These were manned by a combination of regular army units, NKVD troops, hastily assembled militia, and volunteers drawn from factories, offices, and schools. By late October, over 250,000 civilians were directly engaged in the defense of the capital, their labor visible in every ditch dug and barricade built. The fortifications were layered so that any breakthrough by German forces would lead them into successive zones of resistance, ensuring no easy victory. Inside the city, the transformation was even more striking. Buildings were sandbagged, windows taped to mitigate the effects of bomb blasts, and statues wrapped for protection or dismantled to clear fields of fire. Iconic landmarks like the Kremlin were camouflaged with paint and false structures to confuse enemy aircraft. Key ministries and command centers were moved underground or relocated to safer cities further east. Subways doubled as bomb shelters and command posts, a subterranean lifeline where thousands could take cover during air raids. Moscow was no longer just a city. It had become a living fortress, prepared for siege and sustained bombardment. The Soviet leadership made a calculated decision to keep Stalin in Moscow during this perilous time. His presence served as a powerful symbol to both the military and the population that the capital would not be abandoned. Public appearances, speeches, and the famously defiant November 7th parade on Red Square underscored the message that Moscow would stand and fight. Soldiers who marched in that parade were sent directly to the front lines afterward, a vivid demonstration that the city's defense was not merely symbolic but actively tied to the war effort. These gestures had a profound effect on morale, reinforcing the narrative that the Soviet Union would endure, no matter the cost. German forces approaching Moscow found themselves facing not just a fortified city, but an increasingly organized and resilient opponent. The rapid encirclement tactics that had succeeded earlier in the campaign now faltered against the depth and density of Soviet defenses. Wehrmacht divisions advancing along key axes encountered stiff resistance at every turn. Fortified villages, entrenched positions in forests, and counterattacks launched by fresh Soviet reinforcements. Each engagement delayed the German timetable and strained its logistics. Supplies had to be hauled over lengthening lines vulnerable to partisan attacks, bad weather, and Soviet artillery. Tanks and trucks wore down in the mud, consuming precious fuel and spare parts. The weather itself had begun to turn decisively against the Germans. The Rasputitsa, the infamous Russian autumn mud, choked roads and slowed mechanized columns to a crawl. Horses, still widely used by the Wehrmacht for transport, struggled to pull wagons through the muck. Trucks and tanks bogged down, requiring engineers to lay corduroy roads or drag vehicles out of the mire. What had once been a campaign of speed and decisive action became a grinding struggle measured in kilometers and hours rather than sweeping advances. These conditions favored the defenders, who could use their knowledge of the terrain and short interior lines to reinforce sectors under attack more quickly than the attackers could exploit weaknesses. Meanwhile, Moscow's civilians experienced the siege in intimate and harrowing ways. Air raids became a routine terror, sending families rushing to underground shelters as bombs fell on industrial districts, railway stations, and residential areas. Blackouts cloaked the city in darkness at night, while the distant flashes of artillery lit up the horizon. Food shortages loomed as supply lines became strained, and rationing intensified. Yet, despite hardship, the city maintained a remarkable degree of order. Schools continued to operate in reduced form, factories worked around the clock, and theaters and cultural institutions put on performances to bolster morale. This resilience, a blend of stoicism and collective action, was as much a part of Moscow's defense as the trenches and anti-tank barriers ringing the city. For the Germans, the proximity of Moscow was tantalizing but deceptive. They could see the outlines of their objective church spires, railway lines, and the dark silhouette of the city on the horizon. Yet the city remained out of reach. Each assault on the defensive belts met with ferocious resistance, and every breakthrough risked counterattacks that could sever overstretched units from their supply bases. As October bled into November, commanders began to recognize that the window of opportunity for taking Moscow before winter was closing rapidly. Hitler's insistence on pressing the attack clashed with the operational realities on the ground, leaving officers to improvise under conditions increasingly unfavorable to their doctrine. This convergence of military, civilian, and environmental factors made the opening phase of the Siege of Moscow one of the most extraordinary episodes of the Eastern Front. It was not merely a clash of armies but a test of national willpower, played out in the trenches, factories, and streets of a city determined to survive. Every day the Soviets held out not only delayed the Germans but also strengthened the psychological and strategic position of the Soviet Union. Moscow's endurance became a rallying cry across the country, a tangible proof that Hitler's advance could be stopped and that the war's outcome remained far from decided. The tightening of the German grip around Moscow in November 1941 created an atmosphere of both acute danger and extraordinary determination. For the citizens of Moscow, the siege was no longer an abstract threat. It was a daily reality etched in the sound of distant artillery, the whistle of bombs, and the sight of soldiers marching past on their way to the front. Yet despite the proximity of the enemy, the city's heartbeat continued, factories ran, trains shuttled supplies in and wounded out, and the mechanisms of a besieged but unbroken capital held firm. The contrast between the looming peril outside and the measured, collective action within gave Moscow a peculiar quality at this moment in history. A city under siege but not in despair. One of the most striking features of this period was the November 7th parade on Red Square. Under gray skies and amid the echo of distant gunfire, columns of troops marched past the Kremlin walls in a display of defiance unseen in modern warfare. Foreign observers were stunned. A government facing an imminent enemy advance typically evacuated or hid. Yet Stalin chose to stand atop Lenin's mausoleum and watch his soldiers march directly from the parade ground to the front lines. This bold gesture reinforced a sense of unyielding resolve, not only in the defenders but also in civilians across the Soviet Union. It was a moment designed to convey that Moscow would not fall, and that the war was not lost. Behind the spectacle lay a monumental logistical effort. Supplies continued to pour into the city despite air raids and the threat of encirclement. The Moscow Metro, repurposed as a subterranean shelter and command hub, became a lifeline for the population. Entire families slept on station platforms, while trains transported troops and equipment beneath the city with clockwork precision. This underground world functioned as both a refuge and an artery of the defense effort, a striking contrast to the cold and chaos above ground. On the approaches to Moscow, the Red Army fought a series of delaying actions and counterattacks that kept German forces off balance. Units were rotated in and out of the front lines, often at great risk, to ensure that no single formation became exhausted beyond recovery. Reserves were positioned to plug gaps in the defensive belts or launch limited offensives when opportunities arose. These counterthrusts, though often small in scale, disrupted German timetables and forced commanders to divert precious resources from their main assault axes. The Soviets had learned from earlier defeats. The key to survival was flexibility, endurance, and the ability to absorb losses while maintaining overall cohesion. Weather, always a potent factor on the Eastern Front, now began to assert itself with full force. The Rasputitsa's mud gave way to the first hard freezes of winter, locking roads into rutted ice and covering the countryside with frost. German soldiers, still in summer-weight uniforms and lacking adequate winter equipment, found themselves battling not only the Red Army but also the elements. Engines failed to start, weapons jammed, and frostbite crept into the ranks. Horses, overworked and underfed, collapsed in the snow. The Wehrmacht's vaunted mobility, already slowed by extended supply lines, was now further crippled by cold and ice. Every day of delay brought harsher conditions, giving the Soviets a powerful, if silent, ally in the weather. Inside Moscow, daily life bore the mark of a city at war. Air raid sirens sent people scurrying to shelters several times a day, and rationing tightened as food supplies dwindled. Yet the city's cultural life did not entirely vanish. Theaters staged performances, orchestras played, and newspapers continued to publish, each act of normalcy a defiant gesture against the siege. Propaganda posters urged citizens to defend Moscow and strike the fascist invader, reinforcing a sense of unity. Children participated in drills, women worked long shifts in factories, and elderly men joined patrols to guard against saboteurs. Every aspect of life became an extension of the war effort, transforming the city into a single organism bent on survival. For the Germans, the siege of Moscow increasingly resembled a race against time. They had advanced hundreds of kilometers at staggering speed, inflicting enormous losses on the Red Army, but now faced the prospect of a winter campaign without the supplies or clothing needed to sustain it. Commanders debated whether to pause and regroup or press the attack before the city's defenses grew even stronger. Hitler, convinced of the symbolic and strategic necessity of taking Moscow, demanded continued assaults, even as logistical reports and weather forecasts painted a grim picture. This tension between political ambition and military reality foreshadowed the difficulties that would soon engulf the entire Eastern Front. The first skirmishes within the outer defenses of Moscow reflected this changing balance. German infantry and armor, slowed and battered, struggled to breach fortified lines held by increasingly experienced Soviet defenders. Counterattacks from fresh Soviet divisions, some arriving directly from Siberia, added a new dimension to the fighting. These troops, better trained and equipped for winter conditions, brought with them a morale boost that resonated through the ranks of the Red Army. Their arrival marked the beginning of a shift in momentum, even as the Germans continued to press forward. As November turned toward December, Moscow's endurance began to take on symbolic weight across the globe. Allied nations watched closely, recognizing that the fate of the Soviet capital could alter the trajectory of the entire war. If Moscow fell, the Soviet Union might fracture or be forced into a separate peace. If it held, the myth of German invincibility would be broken, and the Eastern Front would become a grinding war of attrition rather than a rapid conquest. The stakes were monumental, and everyone, soldiers, civilians, leaders, understood that the coming weeks would shape history. Thus, the siege of Moscow began not with a single dramatic assault but as a convergence of pressures. The grinding advance of the Wehrmacht, the iron will of the Soviet defenders, the mobilization of a city, and the onset of a Russian winter that would test both armies to their limits. In the heart of the Soviet Union, a city once defined by its culture and administration had become a battlefield, a living symbol of resistance whose survival would echo far beyond its walls. Chapter 6: The Siberian Divisions and the Turning Point. By the end of November 1941, the battle for Moscow had become a brutal test of endurance. The Wehrmacht was at the limits of its strength, its advance slowed by mud, frost, and ferocious Soviet resistance. Yet German commanders still believed that victory was within reach. They had driven farther east than any army in history, surrounding and destroying entire Soviet formations, and were now only a short march from the Kremlin's spires. But what they did not fully grasp was that the Soviet Union still had a hidden card to play. An entire reserve army drawn from the far reaches of Siberia, trained and equipped for winter warfare, now rushing westward to meet them. This moment would prove to be the hinge upon which the fate of Operation Typhoon would turn. The existence of these Siberian divisions was not entirely unknown to the Germans, but they underestimated both their quality and their number. For months, Soviet intelligence had been watching Japan's movements in the Far East. The fear of a Japanese attack on Siberia had forced Stalin to keep a large part of his army on the eastern borders. But by late 1941, thanks to the brilliant espionage of Richard Sorge, an undercover agent in Tokyo, the Soviets learned that Japan had no intention of attacking the USSR that winter. This intelligence gave Stalin the confidence to transfer his best-trained troops westward to defend Moscow. These were not exhausted conscripts. They were elite formations hardened by years of service in harsh climates, equipped with warm uniforms, ski troops, and winterized weapons. Their arrival in Moscow was timed to perfection. As the Germans pushed closer to the city's outer defenses, train after train began unloading Siberian soldiers, their fur-lined hats and white camouflage striking a stark contrast to the worn uniforms of local units. Civilians watched them disembark with a mixture of relief and awe. Here were reinforcements that looked like they belonged to the winter battlefield, moving briskly and confidently despite the snow. They carried new rifles, machine guns, and mortars, and many were accompanied by fresh artillery batteries and T-34 tanks. Machines whose wide tracks and rugged design handled the Russian winter far better than the German Panzer III and IV. Inside the Kremlin, Stalin and his generals debated their next move. Should these reinforcements be used to plug holes in the defensive lines, or should they form the nucleus of a counteroffensive? For weeks, the Red Army had been retreating and holding on by its fingertips. A counterblow, if mistimed, could lead to disaster. But the mood within the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, was shifting. Reports from the front indicated that German units were exhausted, short of supplies, and increasingly vulnerable to flanking attacks. Winter was now an ally, not an obstacle. Stalin, emboldened by the arrival of the Siberians, began to see an opportunity not just to defend Moscow but to push the Germans back from its gates. Meanwhile, on the German side, signs of strain were everywhere. Frostbite cases multiplied as soldiers tried to fight in inadequate clothing. Tanks and trucks, never properly winterized, refused to start in the sub-zero temperatures. Fuel deliveries slowed, leaving armored spearheads stranded without mobility. Ammunition stocks dwindled, and even food rations became unreliable. Officers recorded in their diaries that morale was beginning to sag, especially as the prospect of a quick victory faded. Yet Hitler continued to insist on relentless assaults. He believed that Moscow's capture would shatter the Soviet will and that the Red Army was on the verge of collapse. In reality, the Red Army was about to receive the reinforcements that would transform the battle. The Siberian troops were introduced gradually along the front, often at critical points where German breakthroughs threatened to encircle Moscow. Their impact was immediate. Accustomed to temperatures far below zero, they moved easily through snowdrifts that bogged down German infantry. Their weapons functioned reliably in the cold, and their clothing kept them fighting fit while their opponents shivered and weakened. They were also tactically adept, using skis for rapid movement and launching surprise attacks at night. For the first time since June, Soviet forces had the upper hand in local engagements, and German units began reporting unexpected counterattacks that forced them to halt and dig in. This change in the battlefield's rhythm was subtle at first. Small Soviet offensives retook villages and road junctions that had been lost weeks earlier. Supply convoys reached frontline troops more reliably. Artillery bombardments grew heavier, signaling a renewed stockpile of shells. Most importantly, Soviet commanders regained confidence. They began to coordinate their attacks with greater precision, probing for weak points in the German lines. What had been a purely defensive battle was now evolving into a struggle for initiative. For Moscow's civilians, the sight of Siberian troops on the streets provided a psychological boost. Rumors spread quickly about their skill and toughness. "The men from the east are here," people whispered, as if the reinforcements were a force of nature rather than flesh and blood. Newspapers and radio broadcasts highlighted their arrival, portraying it as proof that the Soviet Union's resources were far from exhausted. In homes and shelters across the city, morale rose perceptibly. Even as air raids continued and food remained scarce, the sense of imminent catastrophe began to fade by late November. The stage was set for a historic reversal. The Germans were still pressing their attacks, but each new thrust met stiffer resistance. The Soviets were no longer merely holding on. They were building up strength for a counterstroke that would shock the world. The weather, the arrival of the Siberian divisions, and the exhaustion of the Wehrmacht combined to create a moment of vulnerability for Hitler's armies, a moment the Soviets intended to exploit. The significance of this turning point cannot be overstated. Until now, the German advance had seemed unstoppable, its victories unbroken. But in the forests and snowfields outside Moscow, the first cracks in that facade were beginning to show. The Red Army, written off by many observers in the summer of 1941, was preparing to launch its first major offensive of the war. For the men at the front, the Siberian divisions were not just reinforcements. They were a signal that the tide might finally be turning. In early December 1941, the forests and frozen plains outside Moscow were transformed into the stage for one of the most significant reversals of fortune in modern warfare. For weeks, the Wehrmacht had pushed forward, convinced that one last effort would bring them the Kremlin's towers and the political collapse of the Soviet Union. Yet every day their formations lost a little more speed, their supply lines stretched a little thinner, and their soldiers grew a little colder. At the same time, the Siberian divisions poured into the capital like a river of reinforcements, refreshing the weary Red Army with troops who looked and moved as though they were born for this landscape. The effect of this convergence was like a coiled spring being released. The Soviet defense hardened and then began to move outward, slowly at first and then with growing confidence. The decision to launch a counteroffensive was not taken lightly. For Stalin, who had spent months reacting to German moves, this was a moment of enormous risk. If the attack failed, Moscow might be lost for good. Yet intelligence from the front was clear. German units were no longer advancing in coordinated thrusts but in isolated, weakened groups. Panzer divisions were short of fuel. Infantry formations were down to half strength. Even the Luftwaffe's once dominant air support was faltering as maintenance backlogs and poor weather grounded many aircraft. Soviet planners realized that a blow delivered now, before the enemy could regroup, might not only save Moscow but also push the Germans back from its gates. On December 5, 1941, as snow fell thickly across the front, the Red Army struck. What began as a series of local counterattacks quickly developed into a broad offensive stretching hundreds of kilometers. Siberian ski troops glided through the forests at night to cut off German outposts. T-34 tanks, whose wide tracks bit deep into the snow, smashed into positions held by frostbitten infantry. Artillery batteries, moved up under cover of blizzards, unleashed bombardments on German supply depots and command posts. For the first time since June, the Wehrmacht was being driven backwards along the entire Moscow sector. German commanders were stunned. They had believed that the Red Army was spent and that no reserves remained. Instead, they faced fresh troops attacking in conditions that paralyzed their own forces. Diaries and letters from German soldiers described the shock of seeing Soviet troops in white camouflage emerging from snowdrifts, moving swiftly and firing accurately while their own fingers numbed on frozen rifle bolts. Vehicles broke down in the cold. Horses collapsed. Men who tried to sleep without proper shelter did not wake up. Units that had once prided themselves on speed and precision now fought desperate rearguard actions simply to survive. Inside Moscow, the news spread rapidly. Radio broadcasts announced that Soviet forces were on the attack. For civilians who had endured months of bombing and deprivation, the change in tone was electrifying. The grim defensive slogans of October gave way to calls for victory and revenge. Factory workers produced weapons and ammunition with renewed urgency, believing that their efforts were now directly fueling an advance rather than a retreat. In the metro stations where thousands still slept at night, people began whispering of the Germans being thrown back, of villages liberated, of the tide turning at last. The effect on German strategy was immediate and chaotic. Hitler, enraged at the retreat, issued orders forbidding withdrawals and demanding that positions be held at all costs. Many commanders found themselves caught between reality on the ground and the Führer's directives. Some units were encircled and destroyed because they were not allowed to fall back in time. Others retreated in disorder, abandoning equipment and leaving gaps that the Red Army eagerly exploited. What had been envisaged as the triumphant end of Operation Typhoon was becoming a frozen rout. The Siberian divisions were central to this success not only because of their training but also because of their morale. They entered battle with a sense of purpose born of months of waiting on the far eastern frontier, ready to prove themselves. Their commanders understood winter warfare intimately, employing tactics that maximized mobility and surprise. Ski patrols cut off roads, demolitions teams blew up bridges, and snipers operated from concealed positions in the snow. These methods eroded the Germans' ability to regroup, turning each retreat into a scramble for survival. As December war on the scope of the Soviet counteroffensive widened. New armies, raised from across the USSR, joined the push. Entire German divisions that had been within sight of Moscow's suburbs were driven back 50, 60, even 100 kilometers. The psychological impact was immense. The aura of German invincibility, built over 2 years of victories, cracked in the snow outside Moscow. Allied governments took notice. In London and Washington, the news of the counteroffensive was greeted with relief. The Soviet Union had not only survived but had struck back, ensuring that Germany would now face a two-front war for the foreseeable future. For the Red Army, the victory was far from complete. Casualties remained appallingly high, and logistics strained under the weight of the new offensive. But the significance of the moment was clear. Moscow had been saved. The capital of the Soviet Union remained in Soviet hands, its government intact, its factories still producing. The Wehrmacht, for the first time, had been forced into a major retreat. The campaign that had begun with Operation Typhoon's promise of a swift knockout blow ended with the Germans thrown back from their objective and the Eastern Front locked into a new, grinding phase. This turning point also reshaped Soviet strategy. The Red Army had learned that with proper preparation, intelligence, and timing it could seize the initiative even after catastrophic losses. The arrival of the Siberian divisions had not just reinforced Moscow. It had provided the backbone for the first counterstroke of a long war of attrition that would eventually push the Germans all the way back to Berlin. In that sense, the snows of December 1941 marked the end of the Blitzkrieg myth and the beginning of a different kind of conflict, one in which endurance, resources, and the ability to wage total war would decide the outcome. By the close of 1941, the world understood that Hitler's dream of crushing the Soviet Union in a single campaign had failed. Moscow stood defiant, its defenders emboldened, its enemy reeling. The Siberian divisions, summoned from the farthest reaches of the USSR, had become a symbol of that defiance and a living embodiment of the Soviet Union's capacity to mobilize its vast human and material reserves. The battle for Moscow was not yet over, but the tide had turned decisively. Chapter 7: Winter Warfare and the Collapse of Operation Typhoon. By the middle of December 1941, the world that had seemed fixed only weeks earlier was shifting with astonishing speed. The Wehrmacht, which had thundered eastwards for months, now found itself staggering under conditions for which it had never prepared. The snow outside Moscow lay in deep drifts and temperatures plunged to -20, -30 degrees Celsius. Metal became brittle, engines refused to start, lubricants turned to paste. Soldiers' breath froze in their rifles. The very ground on which the Germans had built their strategy was now working against them, and the name Operation Typhoon, once meant to evoke unstoppable force, came to describe instead a storm of cold, hunger, and exhaustion tearing through their ranks. What had begun as a race to seize Moscow had become a struggle simply to survive the Russian winter. The fast-moving armored thrusts that characterized Barbarossa had ground to a crawl. Tanks were left immobile in the snow or abandoned because fuel could not reach them. Horses, still the backbone of German logistics, died in droves from exposure and lack of fodder. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets, rags, and anything they could find, their regulation uniforms never intended for this climate. Frostbite sent tens of thousands to field hospitals. Even the German command network began to fray as telephones froze and radios malfunctioned. The Red Army, meanwhile, was learning how to turn winter into an ally. The Siberian divisions had shown the way, but now entire Soviet armies were training and equipping themselves for offensive action in the cold. Artillery was camouflaged under snow, ski troops moved by night, and supply convoys rolled across frozen rivers that had become new roads. Moscow itself became the center of a vast logistical effort to sustain the counteroffensive. Factories churned out winter clothing, new weapons, and the sturdy T-34 tanks whose diesel engines and wide tracks thrived where German vehicles faltered. Each day that passed gave the Soviets more confidence and took away another advantage from their enemies. Inside German headquarters, the tone of reports changed. The optimistic predictions of October were gone. Now officers wrote of regiments down to a fraction of their strength, of panzers immobilized, of supply depots empty. Hitler's insistence on stand-fast orders trapped many formations in exposed positions. Instead of withdrawing to more defensible lines and regrouping, units were ordered to hold frozen villages or windswept ridges where they were slowly encircled by Soviet attacks. Commanders who tried to improvise were reprimanded or dismissed. This rigidity, combined with the weather and Soviet pressure, transformed what might have been an orderly retreat into a series of disasters. On the battlefield, the character of fighting changed dramatically. In place of the swift encirclements of summer, there were now brutal clashes over hamlets, forests, and road junctions. Soviet forces attacked from unexpected directions, using skis to bypass roads and emerge behind German positions. Snipers and small raiding parties harassed supply lines. When the Germans counterattacked, they often found their vehicles stuck and their men too cold to fight effectively. The Red Army still suffered heavy losses, but its ability to replace men and equipment far outstripped that of its enemy. This imbalance was beginning to tell. For the soldiers on the ground, the winter war was a nightmare of endurance. German diaries tell of boots frozen solid, of weapons stripped with bare hands sticking to metal, of nights spent huddled in holes scraped from the snow while shells burst above. Many men believed they would never see Germany again. Soviet troops endured terrible conditions as well, but they were at least clothed and equipped for it, and they fought with the knowledge that their homes and families lay behind them. That sense of defending one's own soil gave a psychological edge that the invaders lacked. The effect on morale on both sides was profound. In Moscow, the sight of German forces being pushed back from the outskirts lifted the city's spirit. Newspapers carried reports of liberated villages and destroyed enemy units. Stalin's speeches shifted from grim appeals to calls for vengeance. In Berlin, by contrast, the mood grew darker. The campaign that had been promised as a lightning blow was now consuming lives and resources without achieving its objective. Allied governments began to reassess Germany's strength. For the first time since the war began, the myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility was cracking. Yet the collapse of Operation Typhoon was not just the product of weather or the arrival of Siberian divisions. It was also the consequence of overextension and flawed assumptions. The German plan had been built on the belief that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly once its major cities were taken. It underestimated the country's capacity to absorb losses, relocate industry, and mobilize new armies. It also underestimated the depth of Russian winter and the logistical nightmare of campaigning across such vast distances. By December 1941, these miscalculations were exposed in full on the ground. The Red Army exploited every weakness it could find. Where roads were impassable, it used sleighs and sledges. Where bridges were blown, it crossed on the ice. Where German lines were thin, it broke through and encircled isolated outposts. Each successful attack, even if small in scale, forced the Wehrmacht to divert reserves or retreat a little farther. Day by day, the front line crept westward, away from Moscow. The capital was no longer in immediate danger. Instead, it was becoming the launch point for a broader push that would define the rest of the winter. By late December, the failure of Operation Typhoon was undeniable. The Germans had not taken Moscow. They had not destroyed the Red Army. Instead, they faced a foe whose strength was growing as theirs ebbed. The battle for Moscow had begun as a test of speed and nerve. It was ending as a testament to endurance and adaptation. In the snowbound fields of Russia, the era of the Blitzkrieg was closing and a new, attritional war was beginning, one in which the Soviet Union would slowly but surely turn the tide. By Christmas 1941, the Moscow sector of the Eastern Front had become a landscape of frozen villages, scorched trees and drifting snow where two armies clawed at each other for survival. Operation Typhoon, once touted as the final push that would end Soviet resistance, was now a campaign in retreat. Instead of raising the swastika over the Kremlin, German troops were digging shallow shelters in icy ground, huddling in captured barns and hoping their thin boots would last another night. The Red Army, buoyed by fresh forces and a growing sense of momentum, pressed its attacks relentlessly. This was no longer a defensive struggle. It was an offensive born of hard lessons learned over months of catastrophe, now applied with ruthless determination. The Soviet counteroffensive gained depth as December rolled into January. It was no longer just the Siberian divisions striking the enemy. Entire new armies assembled from across the Soviet Union were joining in. They came from the Urals, from Central Asia, from the Volga Basin, men drawn from every corner of the vast country, converging on the snowy approaches to Moscow. Railways worked around the clock to deliver them, their trains slipping past bombed-out stations and over frozen rivers. Once at the front, they were issued rifles, ammunition, and, when possible, winter gear produced by factories evacuated hundreds of kilometers eastward. This mobilization was a testament to the Soviet state's ability to adapt under pressure, something the German leadership had assumed was impossible. On the German side, the picture was one of disarray. Units that had once advanced with precision now retreated in fragments, leaving wrecked vehicles, burnt supplies, and frozen corpses behind them. Some formations disintegrated under Soviet pressure. Others fought bitter rearguard actions only to be encircled. Attempts to establish new defensive lines often failed because there were simply not enough men, or because the ground chosen was already compromised by Soviet infiltrations. Even elite units like the Panzer divisions, the pride of the Wehrmacht, were shadows of their former selves, their tanks immobilized by cold or destroyed in combat. Inside Hitler's headquarters, rage and disbelief dominated. He issued no-step-back orders forbidding retreats and demanding that commanders hold ground regardless of circumstances. This turned many positions into death traps. Officers who disobeyed were threatened with court-martial. Some were removed on the spot. The effect was catastrophic. Instead of pulling back to stronger positions, divisions were left exposed and shattered. When they finally did retreat, it was often in panic, leaving behind weapons and wounded. The aura of German invincibility, so carefully cultivated since 1939, was evaporating in the Russian snow. The Red Army exploited this rigidity with increasing skill. Soviet commanders no longer simply blunted German attacks. They planned envelopments and pincer movements of their own. Ski battalions slid through forests to cut off retreat routes. Cavalry and mechanized units, a combination the Germans had not expected, struck at rear areas. Partisan activity in occupied villages disrupted communications and supplies, further weakening German cohesion. Each success gave Soviet troops more confidence, while each German setback deepened the sense of a tide turning in Moscow. The psychological impact of these victories was immense. For months, the capital had lived under the shadow of occupation, with residents digging trenches and barricades in anticipation of street fighting. Now those same people heard that the enemy was being driven back. Streets were still darkened at night and food was still rationed, but the city's mood shifted from grim endurance to guarded optimism. Propaganda posters changed from appeals for defense to calls for vengeance. Newspapers reported not only on battles but on the liberation of villages and the capture of German prisoners. The message was clear. Moscow had survived, and the invader was retreating. For the soldiers at the front, winter warfare was still brutal. Soviet troops were better equipped than their enemies, but they too suffered frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion. Attacks had to be launched in blizzards, trenches filled with ice water, weapons jammed in the cold. Yet the difference lay in preparation and morale. Fighting on their own soil, protected by layers of winter clothing, and inspired by the sight of the enemy retreating, Red Army soldiers found the strength to push on. The Germans, by contrast, felt isolated and betrayed by a high command that demanded the impossible. Many wrote home in despair, warning their families that the winter campaign could not be won. The failure of Operation Typhoon had consequences far beyond the Moscow front. In Berlin, planners who had expected to transfer forces to other theaters now realized that the Eastern Front would consume Germany's resources for years. In London and Washington, the Soviet counteroffensive reassured governments that their new ally would not collapse. Supplies flowing through the Arctic convoys and across Iran began to increase. The perception of the war changed. The Third Reich was no longer an unstoppable juggernaut, but a state that could be checked and ultimately defeated. By January 1942, the Germans had been pushed back up to 250 kilometers from some of their forward positions. Moscow was safe. The myth of a single campaign victory was broken. Yet the Soviet leadership knew that the struggle was far from over. The Red Army's offensive slowed as it outran its supplies and exhausted its troops. The front stabilized again in February, with both sides digging in for what would become a long war of attrition. But the essential shift had already taken place. Operation Typhoon had not only failed, It had marked the beginning of Germany's strategic decline on the Eastern Front and the snow-covered fields outside Moscow. A new phase of the Second World War had begun. The rapid blitzkrieg, reliant on surprise and speed, had been blunted. In its place came a grinding, industrial struggle fought over immense distances and through seasons of unimaginable hardship. The winter of 1941–42 showed that the Soviet Union could survive, regroup, and strike back, and that Hitler's gamble on a quick victory had doomed his forces to a protracted conflict they were ill-prepared to win. Chapter 8. The wider Eastern Front after Moscow. When the smoke of battle finally drifted away from the snowy fields outside Moscow in early 1942, the world's attention remained fixed on the Eastern Front. Operation Typhoon had failed, but the war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was far from over. In fact, what followed in the months after Moscow was arguably just as significant as the dramatic battles that had raged around the capital. The Wehrmacht had been bloodied but not destroyed. The Red Army had gained confidence but not yet achieved full superiority. Both sides were already preparing for the next round, and the sheer scale of the conflict was beginning to dwarf anything Europe had ever seen before. The winter counteroffensive had pushed the Germans back from Moscow, but it had not expelled them from Soviet territory. Millions of Axis troops still occupied a vast swathe of land stretching from Leningrad in the north to the approaches of the Crimea in the south. These were not just conquered regions, but also crucial economic assets. The Germans held much of Ukraine's grain and coal fields, as well as key industrial centers like Kharkov. This meant Hitler could continue to sustain his armies in the east, at least for the time being. It also meant the Red Army had no illusions about the scale of the work ahead. If Moscow had been saved, the rest of the Soviet Union still had to be liberated. In Berlin, Hitler and his generals convened a series of tense meetings in early 1942 to analyze what had gone wrong. They blamed the weather, the strength of Soviet reserves, and the logistical difficulties of operating deep inside Russia. But they did not accept the fundamental error of trying to conquer the Soviet Union in a single campaign. Instead, Hitler resolved to renew the offensive once the weather improved, but with a shift in focus. Instead of striking at Moscow again, he would turn his armies south to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut off the Volga at Stalingrad. This would be Operation Blue, a gamble to deprive the Soviets of their resources and end their capacity to wage war. For the Soviet Union, the months after Moscow were a time of both triumph and danger. Stalin had emerged as the symbol of defiance, but his decisions were not always sound. Believing the Germans were on the verge of collapse, he ordered a broad series of offensives along the entire front in early 1942. These attacks, launched in poor weather and against still formidable German positions, often ended in disaster. Soviet forces were overextended, lacking coordination and supply, and were thrown back with heavy losses in places like Kharkov. It was a sobering reminder that the Red Army still had much to learn about large-scale offensive operations. Nevertheless, the psychological balance of the war had shifted. The myth of German invincibility had been broken. Soviet soldiers who had fought through the winter now believed they could drive the invader from their homeland. Civilians, too, saw that the sacrifices of evacuation and mass mobilization were bearing fruit. Factories relocated to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia began to produce tanks, aircraft, and artillery in staggering quantities, often under conditions of incredible hardship. This industrial miracle ensured that the Red Army would be better equipped for the battles to come. For the German soldier at the front, life in early 1942 was grim. The winter retreat had left units depleted and morale shaken. Supplies of warm clothing and food arrived slowly. Medical services were overstretched, with frostbite and disease claiming more casualties than combat in some sectors. Yet discipline held. German training, propaganda, and fear of punishment combined to keep most formations in line. In the south, where the snow melted sooner, units began refitting and preparing for the next offensive. The Wehrmacht still retained an edge in tactical flexibility and leadership at the lower levels, and Hitler counted on these qualities to deliver victory in the summer. Internationally, the failure at Moscow had a profound effect. Britain and the United States, both desperate for signs that the Soviet Union could hold on, saw the winter counteroffensive as proof that the Eastern Front would tie down the bulk of the German army. This encouraged them to increase aid. Convoys of supplies braved the Arctic seas to reach Murmansk and Archangel, while the Persian corridor through Iran expanded steadily. Trucks, locomotives, foodstuffs, and raw materials poured into the USSR. Though not decisive in 1942, this lifeline would become critical to sustaining Soviet offensives in later years. Meanwhile, the war in the East was beginning to take on a character of total destruction. Entire regions were depopulated by deportations, massacres, or flight. The German occupation regime implemented brutal policies, seizing grain, burning villages suspected of aiding partisans, and deporting millions for forced labor. In response, partisan movements spread behind German lines, disrupting railways and ambushing convoys. These irregular forces tied down thousands of German troops who might otherwise have been at the front. By early 1942, the Eastern Front was no longer just a clash of armies. It was a war of entire societies, fought from forests to steppes and from rail lines to factory floors. As spring approached, both sides looked ahead to another campaign. The Germans hoped that with better weather and new plans they could restore their momentum. The Soviets, though bloodied in their failed winter offensives, had bought precious time to rebuild. The clash that would follow in the summer of 1942 would carry the war to new regions, the Don, the Volga, the Caucasus, and eventually to Stalingrad. The struggle for Moscow had been a turning point, but it was not the end. It was the moment when the war in the East transformed from a lightning strike into a drawn-out, colossal struggle that would decide the fate of Europe. In the frozen trenches and thawing fields of Russia, soldiers on both sides sensed this shift even if they could not articulate it. The quick war was over. What lay ahead was a contest of endurance, resources, and willpower unlike anything the world had ever seen. Operation Typhoon had failed, but in its failure it had set the stage for a war that would ultimately destroy the Third Reich. As the thaw of spring 1942 began to soften the frozen earth of Russia, the Eastern Front transformed once again. The snow and ice that had paralyzed armies gave way to mud, the infamous Rasputitsa, slowing movement and supply, but it also marked a natural pause in operations. This period of mud and melting snow became a time of reflection and preparation for both sides. The Germans looked for ways to regain the initiative, while the Soviets focused on consolidating their gains, repairing their battered forces, and planning for the long haul. Beneath the surface, though, both knew the next phase of the war would be even more decisive than the last. For Hitler, Moscow's failure was a bitter pill, but he remained convinced that the Soviet Union could still be defeated with one more blow, provided it was directed at the right place. His generals, who had originally favored another attempt at Moscow, were gradually persuaded or coerced into supporting a southern offensive. The logic behind this new plan was simple but ambitious. By striking southwards towards the Don and the Volga, the Wehrmacht could seize the rich oil fields of the Caucasus, the breadbasket of Ukraine, and the key transport artery of the Volga River. Deprived of these, the Soviet war machine might collapse from lack of fuel and food. In Hitler's mind, this was a chance to turn the war back into the kind of fast, decisive campaign that had brought him victory in France. But the reality on the ground was more complicated. The Wehrmacht that prepared for Operation Blue in 1942 was not the same force that had swept across the Soviet border the previous year. Its divisions were under strength, its tank fleets worn out, and its manpower stretched thin by commitments across Europe and North Africa. Replacements were arriving, but they were fewer in number and often less experienced. Logistics, too, were a nightmare. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of kilometers over a landscape with limited infrastructure. Fuel and spare parts were always scarce. Even as new plans were drawn, the limitations of reality threatened to undermine them. On the Soviet side, there was a dangerous overconfidence in the early months of 1942. Stalin believed the German army had been fatally weakened and ordered offensives across a broad front to push the invaders out of Soviet territory before they could regroup. These offensives, poorly coordinated and launched into strong German positions, often led to disaster. One of the most notable was the Second Battle of Kharkov in May 1942. Soviet forces advanced too far without securing their flanks, and the Germans counterattacked with their still formidable mobile units, encircling and destroying large Soviet formations. It was a devastating reminder that the Wehrmacht, though battered, remained dangerous and capable of major victories when conditions suited it. Yet these Soviet setbacks were not the same as the catastrophic defeats of 1941. The Red Army absorbed the losses and continued to fight. New units were formed, old ones replenished, and lessons were learned. Command structures improved. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery grew more sophisticated. Above all, the industrial machine relocated to the Urals and Siberia continued to churn out weapons at a staggering rate. For every tank the Germans destroyed, Soviet factories were producing two more. For every regiment lost, replacements were being trained and dispatched to the front. The war of attrition, which Hitler had vowed to avoid, was starting to favor the Soviets. Behind the front lines, the nature of the war was also changing. German occupation policies had grown even harsher, with mass shootings, deportations, and the destruction of entire villages suspected of aiding partisans. This brutality backfired by fueling a vast underground resistance movement. Partisan bands disrupted rail lines, ambushed convoys, and assassinated collaborators. They tied down tens of thousands of German troops who might otherwise have reinforced the front. The Eastern Front had become not only a clash of armies but a war of entire societies, fought from forests to railways to the factories hundreds of kilometers away. The international dimension was equally important. In Washington and London, the winter counteroffensive reassured policymakers that the Soviet Union would not collapse, making the flow of Lend-Lease aid politically easier. American trucks, British aircraft, and canned food began arriving in increasing quantities. Though much of this aid traveled through dangerous Arctic waters under constant threat from U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers, enough got through to make a difference. Soviet logistics and mobility improved thanks to these supplies, laying a foundation for the massive offensives of 1943 and beyond. By the summer of 1942, the stage was set for a new German offensive. Operation Blue, launched in June, initially achieved spectacular gains. German armies surged across the steppe, capturing vast territories and taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners. But even as they advanced, the seeds of future disaster were being sown. The distances were immense, the supply lines fragile, and the Soviet Union far from beaten. The battle for Moscow had already demonstrated the limits of German power. The campaigns of 1942 would reveal them even more starkly. The Eastern Front after Moscow was no longer a story of a single city or a single operation. It had become a vast, rolling conflict stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea, from forests to deserts. It was a war of endurance, industry, and willpower. The Wehrmacht still believed it could deliver a decisive blow, but the Red Army was growing stronger every month. The failure of Operation Typhoon had shifted the balance of the entire war, and though no one could yet foresee Stalingrad, Kursk, or Berlin, the trajectory was already set. The quick victory Hitler had promised was gone forever. In this way, the aftermath of Moscow was less an end than a beginning. It marked the transformation of the Eastern Front into the largest, most brutal theater of war in human history, a struggle that would ultimately decide the fate of Nazi Germany and shape the post-war world. Chapter 9. The Red Army learns to strike back. By the time spring 1942 faded into summer, the Eastern Front had become something very different from the campaign Hitler had envisaged. The defeat at Moscow had forced both sides to reassess their capabilities and their strategies. For the Germans, the answer was Operation Blue, a sweeping southern offensive that aimed to seize the oil of the Caucasus and cut the Soviet Union in two along the Volga. For the Soviets, the task was even more complex: to rebuild an army that had been bled dry in 1941 and early 1942, and to transform it from a force of desperate defenders into one capable of carrying out its own large-scale, coordinated offensives. The process of this transformation was already underway as the snow melted. The Red Army that had stopped the Germans at the gates of Moscow was not the same army that had been shattered in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. It had learned from hard experience. Senior commanders such as Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, who had coordinated the defense of the capital, began developing new methods of planning and control. Staff officers at all levels were trained to work with maps, telephones, and radio in a way that allowed much quicker decision-making and more flexible responses. Coordination between infantry, artillery, armor, and air power became a central focus. Equally important was the human element. The Soviet Union had suffered staggering losses in 1941, but its vast population allowed it to replace those losses on a scale that stunned the Germans. By mid-1942, the Red Army fielded millions of soldiers, many of them newly trained conscripts but increasingly mixed with veterans of the winter counteroffensive. Political officers still played a prominent role, but the crude terror tactics of the early months were gradually replaced by a more professional approach. Units were taught to dig in deeply, camouflage themselves effectively, and prepare counterattacks. Engineers became crucial, laying mines, constructing field fortifications, and improvising bridges across rivers to keep offensive operations moving. The industrial base that supported this transformation had also undergone a metamorphosis. Entire factories had been dismantled and moved east of the Urals in 1941. By 1942, these facilities were back in production, turning out tanks, guns, and aircraft at unprecedented rates. The T-34 medium tank, which had already impressed the Germans with its sloped armor and wide tracks, now rolled off assembly lines in huge numbers. Soviet artillery, once scattered and poorly coordinated, was reorganized into massive batteries capable of saturating enemy positions before an assault. This industrial miracle meant that even after disasters like the Second Battle of Kharkov, new formations could be equipped and sent to the front in weeks rather than months. Still, the learning curve was steep and the cost was high. Stalin's overconfidence in early 1942 had led to several premature offensives, notably at Kharkov, where the Germans once again demonstrated their skill at encirclement. Entire Soviet armies were trapped and destroyed in these failed attacks. But unlike in 1941, the Red Army now had the depth to recover. Rather than collapsing, it absorbed the blow, replaced its losses, and refined its tactics. Each defeat taught valuable lessons about timing, concentration of force, and the importance of reconnaissance. Soviet commanders began to understand how to mask their intentions, shift reserves rapidly, and coordinate combined arms assaults on a scale that would later dwarf anything the Wehrmacht could manage. On the German side, the apparent success of Operation Blue in its opening weeks masked growing weaknesses. As Army Group South surged across the steppe, taking Rostov and heading for the Volga and the Caucasus, its units were stretched ever thinner. Hitler's decision to split the offensive into two parts, one driving toward the oil fields, the other toward Stalingrad, diluted his strength. Logistics became nightmarish. Fuel shortages, worn-out vehicles, and overstretched supply lines slowed progress. Moreover, the Germans underestimated the Soviet capacity to recover and counterattack. They still believed that the Red Army was on the brink of collapse, not realizing that it was already preparing new defenses and fresh counterstrokes. For Soviet soldiers at the front, the summer of 1942 was a paradoxical time. On the one hand, they were facing yet another massive German offensive, which threatened key cities and vital resources. On the other hand, they were better prepared than ever before, fighting on their own soil with an industrial machine and a mobilization system finally hitting its stride. Even when forced to retreat, they did so in a more organized manner, trading space for time, drawing the Germans deeper into a vast and hostile landscape. This strategic patience would prove critical in the months ahead. Behind the lines, partisans were becoming a serious force. No longer just small bands of saboteurs, they were increasingly coordinated with the Red Army, receiving supplies, radios, and orders from Moscow. Their attacks on German rail lines and supply depots not only disrupted logistics, but also forced the Wehrmacht to divert troops from the front to security duties. This second front in the rear eroded German mobility and helped slow the pace of the offensive. International aid also played a subtle but growing role. American trucks gave Soviet formations a mobility they had previously lacked, enabling rapid movement of troops and supplies. British and American aircraft, though a small fraction of the total, supplemented Soviet production. Even basic items like boots, canned food, and medical supplies helped keep soldiers in the field longer. Although this aid would not reach its peak until 1943, its impact was already being felt by 1942 in improved logistics and morale. By the late summer of 1942, the Red Army was on the brink of another trial. Stalingrad loomed on the horizon as the Germans pressed toward the Volga. But unlike at Moscow, where the Soviets had been defending their capital, this would be a battle fought far from the Kremlin, yet of equal, perhaps greater, importance. For the Red Army, it was an opportunity to test its new doctrines and its growing strength. For the Germans, it was supposed to be the decisive blow that would break Soviet resistance once and for all. The stage was set for a confrontation that would eclipse even the drama of Operation Typhoon. As the German offensive rolled further east in the late summer of 1942, the Red Army's transformation from a battered defensive force into a more balanced and dangerous opponent was becoming clearer by the week. It was no longer simply reacting to German moves, but actively shaping the battlefield to its advantage. This shift was subtle at first: defensive lines that held longer, counterattacks that struck at the right moment, the steady appearance of new units in sectors where the Germans thought the front had been emptied. Yet beneath these signs was a larger change in Soviet strategy, one that had its roots in the hard lessons of Operation Typhoon. The Soviets had learned that survival alone was not enough. In 1941, they had thrown divisions into battle piecemeal, trying desperately to plug gaps, and had paid the price in massive encirclements. By 1942, however, staff work and planning had improved. Reserves were held back to exploit opportunities rather than being squandered in panic. Counterattacks were launched only when conditions favored them. Even retreats, once chaotic routes, became deliberate withdrawals designed to trade space for time and bleed the enemy. This discipline gave the Red Army a new resilience. When the Germans reached the outskirts of Stalingrad, they found not a demoralized foe but one determined to make every street and every bend in the river a battlefield. At the same time, Soviet industry was now feeding the strategy with an almost inexhaustible stream of weapons. The T-34 tank, with its blend of mobility, armor, and firepower, had become the workhorse of the front. Self-propelled guns, new artillery pieces, and improved aircraft like the Yak-9 were entering service. Equally critical was the production of trucks, tractors, and rail cars that allowed the Red Army to move supplies and reinforcements with unprecedented speed. This logistical backbone meant that Soviet commanders could shift entire armies from one sector to another, masking their movements and surprising the enemy. In many ways, this mobility would be the Red Army's hidden weapon in the battles to come. The German High Command, meanwhile, was growing increasingly divided. Hitler's decision to split Army Group South into two separate thrusts, one toward the Caucasus oil fields and the other toward Stalingrad, had alarmed many of his generals. They warned that such dispersion would overextend their forces. But Hitler's will prevailed, and so the Wehrmacht advanced along two divergent axes, each consuming fuel and manpower at a rate the logistics system could barely sustain. The further they advanced, the longer their supply lines became, and the more vulnerable they were to Soviet counterstrokes. This vulnerability did not go unnoticed in Moscow. The Soviet General Staff, now operating under the experienced hands of Zhukov and Vasilevsky, began planning not just for defense but for encirclement. Intelligence reports, reconnaissance flights, and partisan observations all painted a picture of German forces stretched thin and exposed. The plan that would later become Operation Uranus, the encirclement of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, was already germinating in the minds of Soviet planners months before the first shells fell on the city. It was a daring concept. Instead of attacking the German spearhead directly, strike at the weaker Romanian and Hungarian armies on its flanks, cut off the main force and destroy it. While this planning was underway, the day-to-day fighting at the front continued with relentless ferocity. In the south, Soviet units fell back slowly, fighting delaying actions along the Don. Bridges were blown, railways sabotaged, and scorched earth policies executed to deny the Germans resources. Civilians fled eastward in long columns, carrying what they could on carts and sledges. Yet even as these retreats took place, new defensive lines were being prepared. The Soviets understood now that time was their ally. Every week the Germans spent advancing brought them closer to exhaustion and further from their supply bases, while the Red Army grew stronger behind the scenes. Partisans behind German lines played an increasingly significant role in this strategy. Equipped with radios and supplied by air, they acted as the eyes and ears of the Red Army, reporting troop movements and striking at vulnerable rail junctions. In some regions, entire swathes of countryside were effectively under partisan control at night, forcing the Germans to travel only in heavily armed convoys. This constant harassment drained manpower and morale. For soldiers who had once marched triumphantly through Europe, the Eastern Front now felt like an endless ambush. Internationally, the Soviet resilience in 1942 further convinced Britain and the United States that their ally could hold out. Lend-Lease shipments increased, with American factories supplying thousands of Studebaker trucks, jeeps, and locomotives. These vehicles, though less glamorous than tanks or planes, gave Soviet formations the mobility to launch and sustain large offensives. Allied deliveries of radio equipment improved communication, while foodstuffs like canned meat helped feed not only soldiers but also civilians in the evacuated industrial zones. This growing support would not win battles by itself, but it underpinned the Red Army's expanding operational capacity. By the autumn of 1942, the contrast between the two sides had become stark. The Germans were still tactically formidable, but their strategic position was deteriorating. Each advance brought diminishing returns and mounting costs. The Soviets, conversely, were learning to integrate their huge resources into coherent campaigns. They had endured Operation Typhoon and the disasters of 1941, survived the setbacks of early 1942, and were now poised to deliver a counterblow of their own choosing. Stalingrad was not just a city on a map. It was the crucible in which the new Red Army was being forged. In the coming months, the lessons learned since the gates of Moscow, the value of reserves, the power of concentrated artillery, the importance of mobility and deception, would be applied on a scale the Germans could scarcely imagine. The transformation begun in the bitter winter of 1941-42 was about to bear fruit. The Red Army was no longer simply a force trying to stave off destruction. It was becoming the instrument of Germany's eventual defeat. Chapter 10. Stalingrad looms. The Eastern Front intensifies. As the summer of 1942 progressed, the Eastern Front evolved into a sprawling, deadly chessboard where both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army sought not merely to win battles, but to shape the course of the entire war. Following the dramatic winter near Moscow and the subsequent months of preparation, the stage was set for one of the most pivotal confrontations of the Second World War, the struggle for Stalingrad. The city, straddling the west bank of the Volga River, was not only a vital industrial hub, but also a symbolic prize. Its capture promised the Germans access to the Volga trade route, control over the southern approaches to the Caucasus oil fields, and a blow to Soviet morale. For Hitler, Stalingrad represented an opportunity to achieve what Moscow had denied him. Army Group South, now stretched across hundreds of kilometers of open steppe, was divided into two primary thrusts. One aimed at the oil-rich Caucasus in the southeast, the other directed at Stalingrad. Initially, the Germans advanced rapidly, exploiting gaps in the Soviet lines and taking advantage of weaker Allied Axis formations on the flanks. Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies bore the brunt of holding these flanks, forming a cordon that was critical for protecting the German spearhead. Yet, these units were ill-equipped and poorly trained, creating vulnerabilities that Soviet planners would later exploit with devastating effect. Meanwhile, the Red Army had learned to view the front not merely as a static line, but as a dynamic network of possibilities. The bitter lessons of 1941, encirclements, overextension, and logistical miscalculations informed every decision. Soviet forces began deploying in depth, with multiple defensive belts, layered artillery, and reserves positioned to exploit enemy mistakes. Reconnaissance became more sophisticated, employing aerial observation, partisan intelligence, and forward scouts to anticipate German movements. Where 1941 had been defined by chaos and improvisation, 1942 was increasingly characterized by planning, coordination, and strategic patience. For the soldiers on the ground, the war had become an unrelenting test of endurance and skill. German troops advanced under scorching summer heat, facing not only the enemy but also extended supply lines and overworked vehicles. Trucks and tanks strained under the steppe's punishing conditions, and fuel shortages became a chronic problem. Despite these challenges, the Wehrmacht still retained significant advantages in tactical training, firepower, and air support. Their panzer divisions spearheaded assaults with coordinated artillery and Luftwaffe cover, attempting to break through Soviet defensive belts before reserves could respond. On the Soviet side, resilience and adaptation were evident in every sector. Infantry units dug deep trenches, camouflaged artillery positions, and established interlocking fields of fire. Engineers worked tirelessly to build defensive obstacles, lay minefields, and construct makeshift bridges across rivers and canals. Ski and cavalry units, remnants of winter warfare tactics, remained on call for rapid deployment in forested or marshy regions. The Soviet emphasis on mobility, surprise, and layered defenses reflected a profound shift from the desperate defensive measures of the previous year to a strategy that could absorb attacks and then strike back with concentrated force. Partisan activity behind German lines further complicated the Wehrmacht's efforts. In southern Russia, large bands of irregular fighters disrupted supply lines, destroyed railway tracks, and ambushed convoys. Every rail delay, fuel shortage, or communication breakdown placed additional stress on German units already stretched thin across vast distances. By the time the Wehrmacht reached the outskirts of Stalingrad, these disruptions, combined with exhausted troops and extended lines, set the stage for an increasingly attritional struggle that would sap German strength even before direct combat commenced. The symbolic importance of Stalingrad also heightened the stakes. Stalin, acutely aware of both the strategic and propaganda value of the city, ordered it to be defended at all costs. Factories continued production under threat of bombardment. Evacuations were organized to remove civilians from the front line while preserving industrial output, and reinforcements were positioned to arrive just in time to plug gaps or launch counterattacks. Soviet planners understood that even holding the city, rather than capturing enemy ground elsewhere, would represent a significant victory in terms of morale and strategic positioning. The Germans underestimated this determination. Initially confident of a swift victory, they assumed that Soviet resistance would crumble once urban combat began. Instead, what they encountered was a meticulously prepared defense, with soldiers willing to fight street by street, house by house, and block by block. Urban warfare, which the Wehrmacht had hoped to avoid in favor of mobile operations, became a deadly test of endurance and tactical ingenuity. Each victory came at a heavy cost, and progress slowed as Soviet defenders exploited their intimate knowledge of the terrain, fortified positions, and improvised traps. Meanwhile, both sides were also aware of the broader strategic picture. The Soviet leadership knew that Stalingrad was more than a city. It was a keystone in the southern theater. Holding it would allow the Red Army to preserve the Volga corridor, protect industrial regions, and eventually set conditions for encirclement operations. For the Germans, taking it meant not only access to resources but also a symbolic triumph that could bolster morale across the Reich, especially after the humiliation at Moscow. The interplay of strategy, symbolism, and logistics made Stalingrad a unique and decisive battlefield in the history of warfare. By the late summer of 1942, the clash for Stalingrad had begun in earnest, heralding a new phase of the Eastern Front. The lessons learned from the winter counteroffensive near Moscow, coordination, resilience, the importance of reserves, and strategic patience, were now being applied on a scale that would test the Wehrmacht in ways they had never experienced. The city's capture or defense would hinge not on speed alone, but on endurance, adaptation, and the relentless capacity to learn from every engagement. As the fighting in the southern sector intensified, Stalingrad itself became a magnet for destruction, drawing both German and Soviet forces into a battle that would test endurance, strategy, and sheer human will. For the Wehrmacht, the initial advance seemed promising. Armored spearheads and motorized infantry had carved deep into the Soviet lines across the steppes, capturing key transport hubs and crossing major rivers. Yet the deeper they moved, the more fragile their position became. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers, vulnerable to attacks from partisans, bad weather, and the relentless Soviet defensive network. Every mile gained demanded immense effort, fuel, and manpower, and each delay amplified the dangers of overextension. Soviet preparations for the defense of Stalingrad were meticulous. From the outskirts to the factories along the Volga, troops were positioned in depth. Every building became a potential fortress. Streets were barricaded. Basements and cellars turned into firing positions. Soldiers were trained to exploit the urban terrain, engaging in close-quarter combat where German advantages in mobility and armor were limited. This shift in tactics reflected the Soviet understanding that a city could become a force multiplier, allowing a determined, well-organized defender to tie down an opponent far stronger in traditional battlefield assets. As German units entered the city, the combat transformed into brutal, grinding house-to-house and street-to-street engagements. Tanks became vulnerable in narrow streets. Artillery could destroy one block but leave another intact for defenders to regroup. The Red Army utilized snipers, machine gun nests, and improvised barricades to slow the advance, inflicting casualties disproportionate to the size of their forces. Each street taken by the Germans was paid for with blood, and every nightfall allowed Soviet units to reinforce, reposition, and prepare counterattacks. Unlike previous campaigns, speed was no longer the decisive factor. The battle became one of attrition and mental endurance. German officers quickly realized that their conventional blitzkrieg tactics were failing in urban conditions. Coordination between armor, infantry, and air support was hampered by the dense cityscape, and supply shortages increasingly restricted operational flexibility. Vehicles broke down in rubble-strewn streets, ammunition ran low, and medical evacuation became nearly impossible. Meanwhile, Soviet logistics within the city, while strained, were supplemented by supplies ferried across the Volga under constant artillery and aerial fire. Every crossing of the river became a lifeline, ensuring defenders could continue fighting despite losses. The psychological dimension of the battle was profound. For the Soviets, defending Stalingrad was about more than territory. It was about national survival and proving that the German invader could be resisted. Propaganda and morale building were relentless. Factories continued production even as bombs fell, and civilians contributed to barricades, dugouts, and emergency medical efforts. Soldiers knew they were fighting not only for the city but for the broader Soviet cause, and this determination made the German advance increasingly costly. On the German side, morale was under strain. The promise of a quick, decisive victory had evaporated. Soldiers who had survived the winter near Moscow, who had advanced across the steppe, now faced an enemy that refused to yield, defended by civilians, and hidden in a labyrinth of streets and rubble. Letters sent home expressed a grim realism. Soldiers described the horrors of close-quarter fighting, the constant threat of snipers, and the impossibility of clearing the city without sustaining massive casualties. Yet discipline, fear of reprisals, and commitment to orders kept units fighting despite dwindling strength. The wider strategic implications of the Stalingrad battle were already apparent to Soviet planners. They recognized that the German army, while tactically superior, was overextended and increasingly vulnerable to encirclement. The Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units guarding the flanks were poorly equipped and unprepared for sustained combat. This created an opportunity for a massive counteroffensive. Soviet leadership quietly prepared the elements of what would later become Operation Uranus, aiming to strike at these weak points and trap the German Sixth Army within the city. Months of preparation, intelligence gathering, and logistical planning were being aligned for a decisive moment. Partisans behind the lines continued to erode German mobility. Rail lines were destroyed or sabotaged, convoys ambushed, and key supply nodes disrupted. German command was aware that their extended lines were a vulnerability, but the pressure to capture Stalingrad quickly meant that reinforcements and logistical corrections often came too late. This interplay between frontline attrition and rear area disruption set the conditions for the eventual encirclement of German forces. The battle for Stalingrad, even in its early phases, reflected a profound shift in the war on the Eastern Front. The Red Army was no longer merely defensive. It had become a complex and adaptive force capable of strategic patience, coordinated counteroffensives, and relentless attrition. The Germans, despite tactical skill and initial successes, were beginning to encounter the limits of their operational reach. The lessons of Moscow and the bitter winter had laid the foundation for this transformation. By resisting, delaying, and preparing for the decisive moment, the Soviets were turning the tide that would eventually lead to one of the most significant victories in the Second World War. Every street, every building, every crossing of the Volga became a microcosm of the broader struggle. Endurance, ingenuity, and adaptation pitted against skill, courage, and overconfidence. The Eastern Front, once defined by rapid movement and dramatic encirclements, was now a crucible of attrition, testing the limits of human endurance and strategic acumen alike. Stalingrad would not just be a battle. It would become the fulcrum upon which the fate of Europe would tilt. Chapter 11. The tide turns. Encirclement at Stalingrad. By late 1942, the Eastern Front had reached a critical inflection point. The months of preparation, attrition, and learning that the Red Army had undergone since the winter of 1941-42 were about to be tested in one of the most daring and consequential operations of the Second World War. Stalingrad, a sprawling industrial city on the west bank of the Volga, had become both a strategic objective and a symbol of Soviet resilience. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, was deep within the city, yet increasingly isolated and overextended. The flanks, held by less capable Romanian and Italian divisions, presented vulnerabilities that Soviet planners had been meticulously studying for months. The Soviets approached this moment with a combination of patience, precision, and intelligence. Unlike the hasty offensives of early 1942 that had resulted in massive losses, the counteroffensive planned for the Southern Front was a carefully coordinated operation. Every division, regiment, and brigade had a designated role. Artillery units were positioned to support breakthroughs, mechanized formations were allocated for rapid exploitation, and infantry prepared for both defensive holding and offensive maneuvers. Reconnaissance had mapped enemy dispositions, weaknesses, and supply routes, providing commanders with the critical information necessary to strike effectively. Operation Uranus, the code name for this audacious plan, relied on a classic principle of warfare: hit the enemy where they are weakest while fixing the strongest parts in place. The Soviet command understood that the German Sixth Army, though formidable within the city itself, depended heavily on its flanks for supplies and reinforcements. These flanks, predominantly manned by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units, were poorly equipped, lacked sufficient anti-tank weapons, and had lower morale compared to German soldiers. By concentrating forces against these sectors, the Red Army aimed to encircle the Germans, cutting off their retreat and trapping the entire army in a gradually tightening noose. Preparation for the operation was immense. Soviet troops were supplied with winter clothing, fuel, ammunition, and food to ensure they could sustain both the initial assault and the encirclement that would follow. Rail networks and river crossings were utilized to their maximum capacity, ensuring that reinforcements could arrive promptly. Partisan activities behind German lines were intensified, disrupting enemy communications, ambushing supply convoys, and sabotaging rail lines. The combination of frontline pressure and rear area disruption would prove crucial in isolating the Sixth Army. When the offensive began in November 1942, the scale of the Soviet assault was breathtaking. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers struck simultaneously along a broad front, supported by thousands of artillery pieces and armored units. Initial breakthroughs occurred where the flanks were weakest, Romanian units, under-equipped and poorly prepared for a concentrated attack, crumbled under the Soviet onslaught. Entire sections of the front collapsed, creating gaps into which Soviet mechanized units poured, exploiting mobility and surprise to maximum effect. The speed and coordination of the assault were overwhelming, catching the Germans off guard despite warnings from field commanders about the vulnerability of their extended lines. The German High Command, including Hitler himself, initially refused to acknowledge the severity of the situation. Orders were issued demanding that the Sixth Army hold its positions at all costs, reinforcing the rigid no-retreat doctrine that had already caused so many difficulties during Operation Typhoon. This decision, intended to maintain a facade of strength, would prove disastrous. Field commanders were constrained from repositioning their forces or coordinating with neighboring armies to relieve pressure, leaving the Sixth Army increasingly isolated as Soviet pincers converged. Inside the city, combat remained ferocious. German troops fought with tenacity, holding block after block, street after street. Snipers, machine gun nests, and artillery emplacements turned every industrial building and residential area into a battlefield. Supplies were scarce, ammunition, food, and medical aid dwindled. Winter was approaching, and the freezing temperatures compounded the misery of soldiers trapped in the urban maze. Civilians, too, were caught in the crossfire, further complicating logistics and movements. Yet despite this relentless pressure, Soviet forces pressed forward, determined not to allow German forces to escape. By late November, the encirclement was effectively complete. Two massive Soviet pincers had met behind the Sixth Army, sealing off retreat routes and creating what would become the infamous cauldron around Stalingrad. For the first time since the beginning of Operation Blue, the Germans were trapped. The consequences were immediate. Supply lines were severed, relief efforts hampered, and morale began to collapse. Hitler, adhering to his insistence on holding the city, forbade any breakout attempts. This decision would have catastrophic consequences in the weeks to come. The encirclement at Stalingrad demonstrated the transformation of the Red Army from a defensive force struggling for survival to a sophisticated, operationally capable army capable of strategic envelopment. Lessons learned from the bitter winter of 1941–42, combined with the improved industrial base, better coordination, and partisan activity behind enemy lines, culminated in one of the most audacious maneuvers of the war. For the first time, the Wehrmacht was facing a truly existential threat on the Eastern Front. The scale of the encirclement was immense. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, along with Allied Axis units, were now contained within a shrinking perimeter. Soviet forces methodically began to consolidate their positions around the pocket, preparing for the next phase. Reducing the trapped army through attrition, starvation, and relentless assault. The world was watching, though few outside the Soviet Union could yet grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding. The tide of the Eastern Front had shifted dramatically. The lessons of Moscow, the failures of 1942, and the meticulous planning of the Soviet command had combined to deliver a blow from which the Wehrmacht would never fully recover. With the German Sixth Army now trapped within the Stalingrad pocket, the city became a crucible of human endurance, military strategy, and desperation. Soviet forces, understanding that the encirclement alone would not suffice to destroy the enemy, began methodically tightening the noose. Artillery units hammered the perimeter from multiple directions, cutting off escape routes and softening defensive positions. Infantry and mechanized units advanced carefully, consolidating gains and preventing German attempts to regroup or establish new defensive lines. Every Soviet move was designed to shrink the German position, while minimizing their own casualties and maintaining supply lines across the Volga. Inside the encirclement, conditions rapidly deteriorated. The Sixth Army, numbering over 250,000 troops, faced dwindling supplies of food, ammunition, and medical care. Winter was approaching, and temperatures began dropping well below freezing. Soldiers huddled in ruined buildings, dugouts, and cellars, rationing what little food they had and attempting to maintain order amid chaos. Disease, frostbite, and exhaustion became as lethal as bullets and shells. Yet for many German officers, the only directive from Hitler remained to hold their positions at all costs, creating a psychological strain that compounded physical suffering. The Luftwaffe attempted to mitigate the crisis through a massive airlift, supplying the encircled forces by air. Yet the effort was insufficient and plagued by logistical difficulties. Bad weather, Soviet anti-aircraft fire, and a shortage of transport planes meant that only a fraction of the needed supplies reached Paulus's troops. The illusion of relief fostered a false sense of hope among German soldiers, who clung to the idea that reinforcements or a breakout could still succeed. In reality, the situation was increasingly untenable, and the lack of mobility left the Sixth Army vulnerable to concentrated Soviet attacks. Soviet commanders, including Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, carefully orchestrated their next steps. Rather than launching indiscriminate attacks, they sought to force the Germans into attrition, exploiting weaknesses in morale, supply, and terrain. Urban combat within Stalingrad slowed, but beyond the city, Soviet forces maintained pressure on the encircled army's perimeter. Sniper teams, artillery barrages, and small unit infiltrations eroded German capability, creating uncertainty and confusion. Even minor breaches were exploited with devastating effect, emphasizing the principle that attrition, patience, and coordination could overcome tactical skill and defensive tenacity. Meanwhile, the strategic context around Stalingrad became increasingly significant. Hitler's insistence on holding the city prevented Paulus from executing a tactical withdrawal that might have preserved parts of the army. Attempts by nearby German formations to break the encirclement were hindered by overextended lines and Soviet defensive preparations. Every delay and failure reinforced the effectiveness of Soviet planning, demonstrating the growing competence and sophistication of the Red Army, which had evolved from the desperate defenders of Moscow into a force capable of executing one of the largest encirclements in military history. Civilians in Stalingrad were caught in the crossfire, with thousands trapped in ruined buildings, forced to survive on limited resources. The city itself became a testament to human resilience and suffering. Factories continued producing under bombardment. Hospitals treated both soldiers and civilians under appalling conditions. Soviet propaganda framed the defense as both a tactical and moral struggle, reinforcing morale and resolve among defenders. This combination of civilian endurance and military determination amplified the challenges for the German forces, who now faced not only military opposition but a city unwilling to yield. On the German side, morale deteriorated as the weeks passed. Letters home revealed growing despair and frustration. Soldiers feared both immediate death and slow starvation, and the disconnect between High Command's directives and the ground reality became starkly apparent. Some commanders privately urged a breakout or requested permission to withdraw, but Hitler's rigid orders prevented flexibility. This overconfidence in ideology over operational reality mirrored the mistakes of Operation Typhoon months earlier, reinforcing a pattern that the Soviets had learned to exploit. As winter tightened its grip, the Soviets applied a combination of blockade and precision strikes to further isolate German units. Supply points were systematically destroyed, communications disrupted, and reinforcements intercepted. Even the elite panzer divisions sent to relieve the Sixth Army found themselves fighting in increasingly difficult conditions, facing well-prepared Soviet defenses and logistical constraints. The stage was set for the final collapse of the encircled forces, a culmination of strategic planning, industrial strength, and the lessons learned since Moscow. The encirclement at Stalingrad also sent a profound psychological message across the Eastern Front. For the first time, the Wehrmacht faced the very real possibility of annihilation in a major campaign, challenging the myth of invincibility cultivated since 1939. For the Red Army, the successful envelopment marked the transition from defensive operations to decisive, large-scale offensive capability. It proved that a combination of strategy, resilience, and meticulous preparation could not only blunt German advances but also decisively turn the tide of war. By the end of 1942, the stage was set for the destruction of the Sixth Army, the liberation of surrounding territories, and the initiation of a Soviet momentum that would carry through to Kursk and beyond. The encirclement was not merely a tactical victory. It represented the culmination of a transformation that had begun during the bitter winter months near Moscow. The Red Army had emerged stronger, smarter, and more coordinated. The Germans, despite technical prowess and tactical skill, were trapped by their overextension, the harsh winter, and the unforgiving lessons of the Eastern Front. Stalingrad would ultimately mark the point where the initiative irrevocably shifted to the Soviets, signaling the beginning of the German decline on the Eastern Front. Chapter 12. The collapse of the Sixth Army, Stalingrad's turning point. The encirclement of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad in late 1942 marked a decisive turning point on the Eastern Front, the culmination of months of strategic planning, logistical preparation, and battlefield learning by the Red Army. The Germans, trapped in a tightening cauldron, faced conditions that tested not only their combat effectiveness but also their endurance, morale, and capacity to survive under extreme pressure. While Hitler remained adamant that the city must be held at all costs, the reality inside the pocket was becoming increasingly dire, and the Soviet forces outside were methodically shaping the conditions for the ultimate collapse. Inside Stalingrad, the Sixth Army confronted a convergence of crises. Supplies of food, ammunition, and medical materials dwindled rapidly as winter approached. Transport shortages meant that only a fraction of the Luftwaffe's promised airlift could reach Paulus's troops. Civilians, factories, and hospitals strained the already scarce resources. Freezing temperatures, disease, and exhaustion compounded the effects of combat, creating a psychological and physical strain that gradually undermined morale. Soldiers found themselves defending urban ruins, fighting block by block, while aware that escape was no longer a possibility. Soviet strategy was disciplined and precise. Outside the pocket, Soviet forces maintained continuous pressure while preparing for the reduction phase. Artillery barges targeted supply nodes and defensive positions, systematically weakening German strongpoints. Infantry units, often working in close coordination with armored and mechanized formations, probed weaknesses, forced withdrawals, and secured advantageous positions. Partisan activity further disrupted German supply lines and communications, ensuring that any attempt at a breakout would face multiple simultaneous obstacles. The Red Army's combination of tactical pressure and strategic patience demonstrated a level of sophistication that had been absent during the desperate winter of 1941–42. The German High Command faced difficult choices. Hitler's insistence on holding Stalingrad reflected his ideological commitment to maintaining appearances and punishing any hint of retreat. General Paulus and his senior officers understood the strategic peril of remaining trapped in a city with dwindling resources. Yet Hitler's orders forbade withdrawal or negotiation. Requests for breakout operations were rejected, and supplies were promised by air, despite the Luftwaffe's inability to meet the logistical demands. This inflexibility revealed a fundamental misjudgment. While German troops were capable of remarkable feats on the tactical level, They were vulnerable to attrition in extended engagements without the necessary logistical support. By December 1942, the Sixth Army situation was increasingly desperate. Frostbite, starvation, and disease claimed more lives than active combat in some sectors. Ammunition shortages limited the effectiveness of counterattacks and defensive fire, leaving troops increasingly exposed. German commanders, constrained by Hitler's orders, were forced to defend positions with inadequate manpower, while Soviet forces outside the pocket exploited every opportunity to tighten the encirclement. Each Soviet attack, whether through direct assault, artillery bombardment, or infiltration, increased the psychological pressure on the trapped soldiers. Fear, exhaustion, and the harsh winter climate combined to erode the army's cohesion. Strategically, the Red Army applied a principle that had been developed over the previous year: to attrit the enemy without unnecessary exposure to risk. The Soviets understood that urban combat favored defenders, but encirclement neutralized the German advantage in mobility and combined arms. By isolating the Sixth Army, the Soviets forced the Germans to fight on unfavorable terms. The surrounding armies could apply consistent pressure while conserving their own strength, knowing that logistical shortages and extreme conditions within the pocket would amplify the effect of each assault. This approach highlighted the Soviet shift from reactive defense to proactive, strategic offense. The psychological dimension of the battle was equally significant. Soviet propaganda framed the encirclement as an inevitable consequence of German overreach, bolstering the morale of troops and civilians alike. For the German soldiers trapped inside Stalingrad, the awareness of being cut off, the dwindling supplies, and the knowledge that no immediate relief would arrive created immense stress. Letters home, diaries, and reports later described despair and a creeping sense of inevitability. Despite the tactical skill and discipline of German units, the situation was no longer one of maneuver but one of endurance against increasingly unfavorable odds. Supply efforts by the Luftwaffe proved inadequate. Despite ambitious plans to supply the encircled army by air, the reality of harsh winter conditions, Soviet anti-aircraft fire, and insufficient aircraft numbers meant that essential items such as fuel, food, and ammunition arrived in fractions of the amounts needed. This failure demonstrated the limits of German logistical planning and the increasing effectiveness of Soviet interdiction efforts. Every failed flight reinforced the impossibility of holding the city indefinitely and underscored the strategic wisdom of the Soviet encirclement. Meanwhile, outside Stalingrad, Soviet forces prepared to exploit the inevitable weakening of the Sixth Army. Fresh units were brought in, artillery concentrations increased, and mechanized reserves poised to cut off potential breakout routes. The Soviets had learned from previous offensives that timing, coordination, and careful allocation of resources were critical to success. By maintaining pressure without overextending, they created conditions where the trapped German forces could be systematically reduced and ultimately destroyed. The approach demonstrated a mature understanding of operational art, integrating reconnaissance, logistics, artillery, infantry, and armored units into a coordinated and sustained campaign. By the end of 1942, it was clear that Stalingrad had entered a new phase. The Sixth Army, once a formidable offensive force, was now trapped, undersupplied, and increasingly weakened by both environmental and operational pressures. The Soviets, in contrast, were operating with growing confidence, employing strategies developed since the winter of 1941–42, exploiting enemy weaknesses, and demonstrating an ability to conduct large-scale encirclement operations with precision. The stage was set for the eventual destruction of the Sixth Army, a defeat that would mark one of the most decisive turning points on the Eastern Front and in the entire Second World War. As the bitter winter of 1942–43 settled over Stalingrad, the trapped German Sixth Army faced a convergence of catastrophic pressures. Encircled by Soviet forces in a meticulously planned operation, the soldiers were isolated from reinforcements and supplies. Cold, hunger, and exhaustion weighed heavily on them. Even the Luftwaffe, tasked with sustaining them through an ambitious airlift, could only deliver a fraction of the necessary provisions due to constant Soviet attacks, freezing conditions, and mechanical limitations. With each passing day, the prospects of survival diminished, and the psychological strain of encirclement began to gnaw at morale and discipline. Inside the pocket, commanders struggled to maintain cohesion. General Paulus, loyal to orders from Hitler forbidding retreat or surrender, directed defensive operations from a command post surrounded by ruined buildings. He attempted to prioritize critical sectors, ration dwindling ammunition, and coordinate limited counterattacks. Yet the realities of urban combat, compounded by extreme winter weather, made effective command nearly impossible. Communication lines were frequently cut, units were isolated from each other, and exhaustion led to errors in judgment. Small engagements in one sector often had ripple effects elsewhere, as defensive gaps opened and Soviet forces exploited every weakness. Soviet forces, in contrast, had mastered operational patience. They did not attempt reckless frontal assaults against entrenched positions within Stalingrad. Rather, they methodically targeted supply nodes, artillery positions, and weak points along the perimeter. Combined arms tactics, which now integrated infantry, armor, and artillery with precision, created a multi-layered system of attrition. The Soviets also employed psychological warfare, understanding that hunger, cold, and isolation would sap the will to fight over time. They knew that by keeping pressure constant and predictable, the Germans would increasingly falter without the need for costly all-out assaults. The Luftwaffe's attempts to sustain the Sixth Army underscored the limits of German planning. While hundreds of transport planes attempted daily deliveries, winter storms, low visibility, and Soviet anti-aircraft fire meant that only a small fraction of fuel, ammunition, and food reached the encircled units. Vehicles frequently broke down in the mud or froze in the cold. Soldiers rationed what little they received, often eating minimal portions while their equipment deteriorated under constant use. Fuel shortages made the deployment of tanks and vehicles impossible, leaving mechanized units immobilized and vulnerable. The mismatch between operational demands and logistical reality was now glaringly evident. Soviet planning went beyond simple containment. Fresh units, reserves, and artillery were strategically positioned to cut off potential breakout routes and prevent German relief operations. Reconnaissance, both aerial and partisan-based, ensured that any movement by the trapped Germans could be monitored and countered. Mines and improvised obstacles were placed along likely avenues of escape. The Soviets had transformed encirclement from a temporary tactical maneuver into a strategic instrument designed to systematically destroy an entire army while conserving their own forces. Urban combat within Stalingrad continued to take an enormous toll on both sides. Buildings reduced to rubble became defensive strongholds, while narrow streets limited the effectiveness of German armored vehicles. Snipers, machine gun nests, and improvised traps slowed every advance. German units, although disciplined and experienced, were increasingly exhausted, and casualties mounted daily. Reinforcements, whether from air or ground, were scarce, and even elite units were unable to achieve significant breakthroughs. The battle became a war of attrition where survival, endurance, and discipline were as critical as firepower. By early 1943, the cumulative effect of encirclement, attrition, and logistical deprivation had transformed the situation from precarious to catastrophic. Starvation, frostbite, and disease reduced the effective strength of the Sixth Army dramatically. Soldiers scavenged what they could, often eating horses, rats, or discarded rations. Morale deteriorated further as the realization dawned that no effective relief was imminent and that Hitler's orders forbidding withdrawal meant that they were trapped indefinitely. Command cohesion frayed, and discipline became increasingly difficult to enforce. Soviet forces exploited this weakening systematically. Artillery bombardments targeted supply depots and command centers. Infantry infiltrated gaps in the perimeter, and armored units cut off isolated pockets of resistance. By simultaneously attacking multiple points and maintaining continuous pressure, the Soviets ensured that German units could neither consolidate nor organize an effective breakout. Each engagement reinforced the inevitability of the outcome. The Sixth Army's destruction was not a matter of if, but when. The collapse of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad would not only be a military disaster but also a psychological blow to the Wehrmacht and the Nazi regime. Hitler's insistence on holding the city had overruled operational logic, and the failure underscored the limits of his command philosophy. Conversely, the Red Army had demonstrated remarkable growth. Operational sophistication, coordination, patience, and the ability to execute a large-scale encirclement with precision. The victory validated the lessons learned since Moscow, the improvements in industrial capacity, and the skillful integration of infantry, armor, artillery, and partisan support. By the end of February 1943, the German Sixth Army had formally surrendered, marking one of the most decisive defeats in military history. Tens of thousands of soldiers were captured, and the myth of German invincibility on the Eastern Front was shattered. Stalingrad had become the fulcrum on which the momentum of the Eastern Front shifted irrevocably. The Red Army, having learned to absorb, adapt, and then decisively strike back, now held the initiative, setting the stage for subsequent offensives that would ultimately drive the Wehrmacht from Soviet territory. Chapter 13. After Stalingrad's Soviet momentum and German desperation, the fall of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad in February 1943 was not merely a tactical defeat. It represented a strategic rupture that reverberated across the Eastern Front and altered the trajectory of the Second World War. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. German forces, previously perceived as almost invincible, now faced the reality of sustained attritional warfare against a Red Army that had learned not only to survive but to strike back with precision. Stalingrad demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated, large-scale encirclement operations and revealed the limits of German overextension, overconfidence, and logistical planning. The shockwaves from Stalingrad were felt across the Wehrmacht and Nazi leadership. Hitler, while publicly maintaining defiance, privately realized that the Eastern Front was no longer a theater of quick victories or decisive blitzkrieg campaigns. German generals, already strained by the vast distances, harsh winter conditions, and Soviet resilience, were confronted with a new reality. Strategic initiative had shifted irreversibly to the Red Army. Army Group South had suffered catastrophic losses, including elite panzer divisions, experienced infantry, and valuable equipment. Rebuilding these formations would take months, during which the Soviets could exploit every weakness along the front. Soviet command, emboldened by the success at Stalingrad, began consolidating its gains and preparing for the next phase of the offensive. Georgy Zhukov, Alexander Vasilevsky, and other senior commanders understood that momentum was now their greatest advantage. Reinforcements from the interior regions of the Soviet Union were being mobilized and sent to critical sectors. Industrial output, particularly of tanks, artillery, and ammunition, had surged following the wartime relocation of factories beyond the Urals, providing the Red Army with the resources to sustain multiple simultaneous offensives. The Soviets had not only recovered from the disasters of 1941 and early 1942, but had transformed into a formidable, operationally competent force capable of dictating the terms of war. In the wake of Stalingrad, German forces attempted to regroup and shore up defensive lines. Army Group Center and Army Group North were reinforced to prevent further Soviet breakthroughs, while the remnants of Army Group South were reorganized to protect vital territories in Ukraine and the southern steppes. However, these efforts were hindered by systemic problems: overextended supply lines, a shortage of experienced troops, winter attrition, and declining morale. The psychological impact of Stalingrad weighed heavily on both soldiers and commanders. The notion of invincibility had been shattered, leaving German forces increasingly cautious and reactive. Soviet operational planning became more ambitious. Recognizing the weakened state of German forces across the front, Soviet commanders began planning coordinated offensives aimed at liberating occupied territories while exploiting the vulnerabilities exposed by Stalingrad. Mechanized corps, supported by artillery and air power, were integrated into a new doctrine emphasizing deep operations, encirclements, and rapid exploitation of breakthroughs. Lessons from Moscow, Kharkov, and Stalingrad informed every decision. Reserves were held back for decisive maneuvers, logistical lines were reinforced, and reconnaissance informed operational timing. The Red Army had evolved from a reactive defensive force into a proactive strategic machine capable of sustained offensives. The human cost of these operations, however, remained immense. Civilians in liberated regions faced both the devastation left by retreating German forces and the challenges of rebuilding under wartime conditions. Partisan activities previously focused on disruption were now integrated with the broader operational strategy, providing reconnaissance, sabotage, and support for advancing Soviet formations. Every step forward involved coordination between conventional military units and irregular forces, a testament to the increasing sophistication of Soviet strategy. The German response to the post-Stalingrad situation was marked by desperation and improvisation. Hitler's strategic vision for the Eastern Front had always been ambitious, but the failure at Stalingrad forced him to adopt increasingly rigid and unrealistic directives. Orders forbidding retreat or tactical withdrawal created friction with experienced commanders, while attempts to patch defensive lines with undertrained or exhausted troops provided only temporary stability. The Wehrmacht, once celebrated for operational flexibility and rapid maneuver, was now constrained by overextension, attrition, and a command structure increasingly divorced from frontline realities. Meanwhile, the Red Army's confidence was amplified by its industrial capacity. The relocation of factories east of the Urals, combined with increased Lend-Lease support from the Allies, provided a steady flow of tanks, artillery, trucks, and other essential supplies. Mechanized and armored formations could now operate at a tempo and scale previously impossible, allowing the Soviets to plan simultaneous offensives across multiple sectors. Artillery, once scattered and poorly coordinated, now functioned as a decisive instrument of battlefield dominance, often delivering concentrated firepower that could overwhelm German defensive positions before infantry assaults. By spring 1943, the momentum gained from Stalingrad had become more than symbolic. It had reshaped the operational landscape of the Eastern Front. Soviet forces were no longer merely reacting to German initiatives. They were driving the timetable of war. The Germans, constrained by geography, weather, and diminishing reserves, were increasingly forced into defensive operations that demanded continuous adaptation and improvisation. Every Soviet advance further exposed the vulnerabilities created by Hitler's decisions to overextend, split commands, and ignore logistical realities. Stalingrad's aftermath also had a profound psychological impact on the German population and military. For decades, propaganda had portrayed the Wehrmacht as invincible, Yet the surrender of an entire army undermined that narrative. For Soviet forces and civilians, the victory reinforced confidence in both the Red Army's capabilities and the broader Soviet war effort. The psychological shift was as critical as the strategic one. For the first time, the Soviets could envision not only stopping the Germans but driving them from occupied territory, reclaiming lost lands, and ultimately achieving a decisive victory on their own soil. As the Soviets consolidated the victory at Stalingrad, the momentum on the Eastern Front began to swing decisively in their favor. Soviet planners understood that the destruction of the German Sixth Army was not merely a tactical success, but a strategic opportunity to reclaim territory, weaken enemy morale, and set conditions for further offensives. The months following Stalingrad would see the Red Army transition from defensive operations and isolated counterattacks to sustained, coordinated campaigns across multiple fronts, demonstrating an operational maturity that had been honed through bitter lessons learned during the winter of 1941-42 and the grueling engagements of 1942 in the south. Liberated territories were gradually reoccupied, providing strategic depth for new offensives. Soviet forces moved to secure key transportation hubs, river crossings, and industrial centers, ensuring that supply lines could support subsequent advances. The integration of partisan networks with conventional military operations proved invaluable. Partisans disrupted remaining German units, gathered intelligence, and assisted in logistical coordination for advancing Soviet formations. This synergy allowed the Red Army to maintain pressure on retreating enemy forces while simultaneously preparing for deeper operations into occupied territories. The Wehrmacht, reeling from the loss at Stalingrad, faced a crisis of leadership and resources. Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs had led to the destruction of one of Germany's most formidable armies, and other formations were now forced into reactive, defensive postures. Supplies, already stretched thin across a vast front, became increasingly scarce. Reinforcements were often undertrained and under-equipped, and morale plummeted in units witnessing repeated failures. Officers who had once relied on tactical flexibility were now constrained by directives that emphasized ideological stubbornness over operational necessity. This combination of strategic miscalculations and declining capability left the Wehrmacht vulnerable to Soviet exploitation. Meanwhile, the Red Army's operational doctrine continued to evolve. The success of encirclement operations at Stalingrad underscored the value of combining mobility, deception, and concentrated firepower. Soviet commanders refined the use of mechanized corps and tank formations to exploit breakthroughs, while artillery concentrations became increasingly decisive in both offensive and defensive engagements. Coordination between infantry, armor, and air support was now systematic rather than ad hoc, reflecting lessons drawn from Moscow, Kharkov, and Stalingrad. Reserves were held not merely to patch gaps, but to deliver decisive blows at critical points, demonstrating an operational sophistication that increasingly frustrated German defensive efforts. The psychological impact of Soviet victories extended beyond the battlefield. Civilian populations in liberated areas often welcomed advancing troops, assisting in logistics, providing intelligence, and facilitating reconstruction. This civilian support enhanced the sustainability of Soviet operations, reducing the burden on military supply lines and creating conditions for continuous advancement. Conversely, German soldiers, demoralized by repeated defeats and the inability to regain the initiative, experienced a growing sense of inevitability. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, carefully cultivated since the early campaigns of 1939-41, was shattered, leading to increased desertions, lowered morale, and hesitation in executing offensive operations. In strategic terms, Stalingrad's aftermath enabled the Red Army to dictate the tempo of operations across the southern and central sectors of the Eastern Front. The Germans, forced into defensive postures, were often reacting to Soviet initiatives rather than shaping them. This shift was critical. It allowed the Soviets to choose when and where to strike, concentrate forces effectively, and exploit weaknesses in enemy lines with precision. The increasing use of deep operations, penetrating enemy lines to strike at logistics, command centers, and reserves, demonstrated the Red Army's growing capability to conduct sophisticated, multidimensional campaigns. The winter and spring of 1943 also highlighted the importance of logistics and industrial capacity in sustaining military momentum. Soviet factories, relocated east of the Urals and now operating at peak efficiency, provided a continuous stream of tanks, artillery, trucks, and other essential equipment. Lend-Lease supplies from the Allies supplemented these efforts, ensuring that mechanized formations could operate at high tempo. This industrial advantage allowed the Soviets to replace losses quickly, reinforce breakthroughs, and maintain operational pressure, while the Germans struggled to compensate for the destruction of the Sixth Army and the depletion of other frontline units. German attempts to stabilize the front after Stalingrad were largely reactive. Defensive lines were hastily reinforced, with undertrained and exhausted troops thrown into vulnerable sectors. Hitler's rigid command directives limited operational flexibility, preventing commanders from executing tactical withdrawals or concentrating forces effectively. Supply shortages further exacerbated the situation, while the morale crisis among troops weakened defensive cohesion. The contrast between German inflexibility and Soviet operational agility became increasingly apparent, foreshadowing subsequent defeats in battles such as Kursk and the subsequent Soviet offensives of 1943–44. By mid-1943, the lessons of Stalingrad had become evident across the Eastern Front. The Red Army had demonstrated that a combination of strategic patience, operational coordination, and effective logistics could not only halt a German advance but also deliver decisive, large-scale victories. Soviet forces were no longer merely reacting to German initiatives. They were setting the operational agenda, choosing the timing, location, and scale of engagements. The destruction of the Sixth Army had shifted the initiative decisively, and subsequent campaigns would continue to exploit the vulnerabilities exposed by Stalingrad, accelerating the German retreat and setting the stage for liberation across Eastern Europe. Stalingrad had become more than a military victory. It was a symbol of transformation, resilience, and strategic mastery. The Red Army, forged in the bitter crucible of Moscow, winter 1941, and the grueling battles of 1942, had emerged as a dominant force capable of shaping the course of the war. The Wehrmacht, once the unstoppable juggernaut of Europe, had been decisively checked. The psychological and operational consequences of this battle would resonate through the remainder of the Eastern Front campaign, fundamentally altering the trajectory of World War II. Chapter 14. Kursk beckons, preparing for the next great clash. The momentum gained by the Red Army following the decisive victory at Stalingrad created both opportunities and challenges as 1943 progressed. The destruction of the German Sixth Army had irreversibly shifted the initiative on the Eastern Front, but the war was far from over. Hitler, unwilling to accept defeat, began planning a massive counterstroke to regain the strategic initiative. The Germans sought to stabilize their front, rebuild their depleted formations, and prepare for a decisive confrontation that could reverse their fortunes. This anticipation would culminate in the Battle of Kursk, one of the largest and most meticulously planned engagements of the Second World War. The Soviet High Command, aware of German intentions, did not rest. The Red Army used the months following Stalingrad to consolidate territorial gains, rebuild units, and fortify potential German attack corridors. Intelligence gathering became a central focus, with spies, reconnaissance units, and aerial photography mapping German troop movements, equipment, and logistics. Knowledge of the enemy's operational patterns allowed Soviet planners to anticipate the locations, timing, and scale of the expected German offensive. This strategic foresight would prove crucial in what was to become a battle of attrition and preparation on an unprecedented scale. At the same time, the Germans were reconstituting Army Group South and other formations battered by Stalingrad. Replacement troops, including new divisions and partially trained conscripts, were rushed to the front. Elite panzer divisions received priority for tanks, mechanized equipment, and air support, while infantry formations were reinforced with weaponry salvaged from previous engagements. However, the rebuilding process was uneven. Shortages of fuel, trained personnel, and experienced commanders persisted. Logistics remained a persistent challenge, and overconfidence stemming from early successes in 1941 and 1942 clouded operational judgment. The Soviets, learning from the attritional urban warfare of Stalingrad, focused on creating an integrated defensive system that could absorb a German assault and then deliver counterblows. Massive minefields, anti-tank ditches, fortified bunkers, and interlocking artillery positions were constructed along expected German avenues of attack. Infantry, artillery, and tank units were layered in depth, allowing the Soviets to trade space for time, weakening attacking forces while preserving their own operational flexibility. This comprehensive approach reflected the evolution of the Red Army from a reactive force into one capable of strategic foresight, operational depth, and effective coordination across multiple fronts. The psychological component of preparation was equally significant. Soviet soldiers and commanders were emboldened by the victory at Stalingrad, understanding that they were no longer merely defending their territory but actively shaping the broader course of the war. Morale was reinforced through both propaganda and practical incentives, emphasizing the opportunity to decisively weaken German forces and liberate occupied territories. Conversely, German troops faced the residual shock of Stalingrad, with fear, fatigue, and uncertainty undermining confidence in the face of an enemy that had proven both resilient and increasingly sophisticated. Operational planning on both sides reached unprecedented levels of complexity. The Soviets established multiple defensive belts, incorporating natural terrain features such as rivers, forests, and elevation changes to maximize the effectiveness of their positions. Armored units were held in reserve, ready to exploit German overextension, while artillery was pre-registered to deliver rapid and precise barrages. Communication networks were reinforced to ensure that orders and intelligence could be transmitted quickly across dispersed units. In short, the Red Army sought to convert every strategic, tactical, and environmental advantage into a systematic mechanism for attrition and counteroffensive operations. For the Germans, the anticipated summer offensive of 1943, codenamed Operation Citadel, was designed to replicate previous successes. Rapid armored thrusts intended to encircle and destroy Soviet forces. German planners emphasized concentrated force, tactical mobility, and surprise. Panzer divisions were to spearhead attacks, supported by Luftwaffe air superiority and artillery barrages designed to break the first line of Soviet defenses. Yet despite meticulous planning, the Germans faced the challenge of overextended supply lines, depleted manpower, and an increasingly capable adversary who had learned to anticipate mechanized maneuvers and exploit weaknesses. Soviet intelligence played a pivotal role in shaping the forthcoming engagements. By early 1943, the Red Army had intercepted German communications, deployed reconnaissance teams along key approaches, and monitored the movement of reinforcements. This allowed them to prepare defenses precisely where the attack was expected, to position reserves optimally, and to pre-register artillery for maximum effect. The ability to anticipate enemy movements and to coordinate a multi-layered defense represented a dramatic evolution in Soviet operational art, reflecting lessons learned from Stalingrad, Moscow, and the winter campaigns. The stage for Kursk was thus set as a complex interplay of strategy, preparation, and anticipation. The Germans, seeking a decisive victory to reverse their losses, faced an enemy that had transformed urban and attritional warfare lessons into strategic depth and operational competence. Both sides mobilized unprecedented resources, with industrial capacity, manpower, and logistics tested to the limit. As the summer approached, the largest armored formations of the war prepared to collide in a confrontation that would test not only tactics and firepower but the endurance, planning, and adaptability of both commanders and soldiers. As summer 1943 approached, the Eastern Front became a landscape of meticulous preparation and tense anticipation. The Germans, seeking to reclaim the strategic initiative lost at Stalingrad, concentrated their forces in the Kursk salient, a protruding bulge in the Soviet lines that offered the potential for encirclement and destruction of the Red Army formations there. Operation Citadel, the planned German offensive, was conceived with the intent of delivering a decisive blow, employing concentrated armored thrusts supported by air and artillery, aiming to replicate the swift victories of 1941–42. However, the Soviets were not only aware of German intentions but had used the preceding months to create defenses of unprecedented depth and sophistication, ensuring that any attack would be met with coordinated, multi-layered resistance. The Red Army's defensive preparations around Kursk represented a culmination of lessons learned from Moscow, Kharkov, and Stalingrad. Anticipating German armored spearheads, Soviet engineers and infantry constructed vast minefields, anti-tank ditches, fortified bunkers, and interconnected trench systems. Artillery positions were pre-registered to cover anticipated avenues of attack, allowing for rapid, concentrated fire at the first sign of German advance. Reserves, particularly mechanized and tank formations, were held in depth to launch counterattacks when enemy armor became overextended. This comprehensive defensive network was designed not only to absorb the German assault but also to inflict maximum attritional damage, turning the anticipated blitzkrieg into a grinding struggle in which mobility and tactical surprise would be neutralized. Intelligence played a crucial role in Soviet planning. Through a combination of intercepted communications, reconnaissance patrols, aerial observation, and partisan reports, Soviet commanders had a detailed understanding of German deployments, unit composition, and movement patterns. This allowed for strategic placement of defenses, allocation of reserves, and coordination of artillery and armored units. Unlike earlier campaigns where surprise and rapid maneuver had favored German advances, the Soviets had turned foresight and preparation into an operational weapon, forcing the Wehrmacht to confront a prepared, disciplined, and adaptive enemy. For the Germans, Operation Citadel required the coordination of multiple panzer divisions and infantry formations advancing along narrow axes. The plan called for armored spearheads to punch through the Soviet defensive belts, followed by mechanized exploitation units encircling Soviet forces from multiple directions. Luftwaffe support was crucial, with air superiority intended to disrupt Soviet movements, strike artillery positions, and provide reconnaissance. Yet despite meticulous planning, the Germans faced several challenges. Terrain that favored defenders, depleted manpower following Stalingrad, shortages of fuel and supplies, and an enemy that had mastered both defensive depth and rapid counteroffensive tactics. The operation was thus as much a test of logistics, coordination, and adaptability as it was of tactical execution. Soviet commanders, including Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, emphasized patience and discipline. Unlike previous engagements where hasty attacks or overextended offensives had cost Soviet lives, the focus at Kursk was on controlled attrition and operational depth. Troops were trained to hold initial defensive positions, absorb German attacks, and then exploit weaknesses created by overextension. This doctrine required not only careful timing but also effective communication, as reserves needed to be deployed precisely where they could deliver the greatest effect without creating gaps in the defensive line. The psychological dimension of the upcoming clash was significant. Soviet soldiers, emboldened by Stalingrad and subsequent territorial gains, were motivated by both ideological commitment and practical experience. They understood that failure was not an option, and that the battle at Kursk would determine the operational tempo of the Eastern Front for months to come. German troops, while experienced and disciplined, faced the psychological burden of Stalingrad's lessons. The knowledge that overconfidence and underestimation of Soviet capability could lead to encirclement and disaster. The mental stakes were as high as the physical ones, shaping the conduct of commanders and soldiers alike. Logistics remained a defining factor in both preparations. Soviet forces benefited from secure supply lines behind the front, industrial capacity in the Urals, and the integration of Lend-Lease materials, ensuring that mechanized formations could operate at high tempo. German logistics, while robust by historical standards, faced challenges of extended lines, fuel shortages, and reliance on troops still recovering from previous campaigns. This contrast in logistical capacity would play a critical role once the battle commenced, influencing both the operational tempo and the sustainability of offensive or defensive operations. As July 1943 approached, the stage for the Battle of Kursk was set. The largest concentration of armored forces in history prepared to collide in a confrontation that would test every aspect of military doctrine: planning, logistics, coordination, morale, and adaptability. The Germans aimed for a decisive victory that could restore initiative on the Eastern Front, while the Soviets had transformed their defensive preparations into a weapon capable of blunting and destroying the enemy's spearhead. Both sides had learned from prior experiences, and the battle would serve as a testament to the evolution of warfare on the Eastern Front, combining industrial scale, operational art, and human endurance in a confrontation that would resonate through history. Chapter 15: Kursk and Beyond. The strategic shift on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 represented not merely a clash of armored titans, but a decisive moment that solidified the strategic shift on the Eastern Front. The German offensive, Operation Citadel, aimed to encircle and destroy Soviet forces within the Kursk salient, repeating the lightning maneuvers that had brought early successes in 1941 and 1942. Yet the Soviets, having anticipated the assault, had transformed the battlefield into a meticulously prepared defensive network. Minefields, fortified positions, pre-registered artillery zones, and deep reserves combined to create a layered defense that would absorb the German thrusts, bleed the attacking forces, and set conditions for a Soviet counteroffensive that would fundamentally alter the operational landscape. From the opening hours of July 5th, the German armored spearheads met resistance unlike any previously encountered on the Eastern Front. Tanks and mechanized infantry advancing through mine-laden terrain faced concentrated artillery fire and coordinated infantry anti-tank efforts. Soviet reserves, positioned in depth, counterattacked at critical moments, exploiting the overextension of German panzer units and disrupting their cohesion. The speed and decisiveness that had characterized the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics were neutralized by a combination of preparation, coordination, and depth, demonstrating the operational maturity of the Red Army. The Luftwaffe, tasked with providing air superiority and tactical support, encountered its own limitations. Soviet air defenses, integrated with frontline units and supplemented by fighter intercepts, reduced the effectiveness of bombing and reconnaissance missions. The anticipated German ability to dominate the skies and disrupt Soviet defenses was contested at every turn, highlighting the growing parity in technology, training, and coordination between the two sides. Air engagements over Kursk became intense, with control of the air fluctuating as both sides committed resources to support ground operations, while attrition further strained German capabilities on the ground. The battle quickly escalated into a war of attrition. Mines destroyed tanks before they could reach defensive positions, artillery barrages disrupted formations, and Soviet counterattacks struck vulnerable flanks. German panzer divisions, despite their training and experience, found progress slow and costly. Every kilometer gained required immense expenditure of manpower, ammunition, and fuel. The attritional nature of the engagement tested operational endurance as severely as tactical skill, reinforcing the lesson learned repeatedly since Stalingrad. The Red Army could absorb and adapt to even the most concentrated German assaults. Strategically, the Soviets had achieved their primary objective, to blunt the German offensive while preserving their own forces. The massive defensive preparation allowed them to control the tempo of the engagement, dictate the timing of counterattacks, and exploit weaknesses in the overextended German formations. By delaying and weakening the Wehrmacht's thrust, the Soviets created conditions in which a concentrated counteroffensive could be launched, turning a defensive engagement into an opportunity to reclaim initiative and territory. The effectiveness of this strategy underscored the Red Army's evolution from a force struggling for survival in 1941 to an operationally sophisticated army capable of planning and executing large-scale, coordinated campaigns. The human dimension of Kursk was staggering. Both sides committed hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and extensive artillery formations. Casualties mounted rapidly, with intense combat, artillery fire, and aerial attacks exacting a heavy toll. German soldiers, already weakened by previous campaigns and the losses at Stalingrad, faced the psychological pressure of sustained combat against a prepared and increasingly confident adversary. Soviet troops, while motivated by recent victories and defensive preparation, endured extreme exertion under relentless conditions, yet their discipline and training allowed them to withstand the initial German assaults and prepare for counterattacks. The counteroffensive, launched by the Soviets once the German advance had stalled, marked a turning point in operational initiative. Mechanized corps, supported by artillery and air units, struck at weakened sectors, exploiting gaps and overextended German positions. German forces, already depleted and suffering from attrition, were forced into reactive defensive measures. The Red Army, controlling both the tempo and the operational depth of the engagement, began reclaiming territory, reversing German gains, and demonstrating that the Wehrmacht could no longer dictate the strategic rhythm of the Eastern Front. By the end of July, Kursk had transitioned from a defensive success to a decisive strategic victory for the Soviets. German forces had suffered irrecoverable losses in men and material, and the offensive had failed to achieve its objectives. The initiative firmly rested with the Red Army, which now had the capability to plan sustained offensives across multiple sectors of the Eastern Front. Operational planning, combined arms integration, logistical efficiency, and strategic patience had transformed the Red Army into a force capable of challenging, and ultimately overcoming, the Wehrmacht in battles of both attrition and maneuver. The consequences of Kursk extended beyond immediate military outcomes. The failure of Operation Citadel demoralized German troops, reinforced doubts among commanders, and shifted the psychological balance in favor of the Soviets. The victory allowed the Red Army to pursue further offensives in Ukraine, Belarus, and eventually into Eastern Europe, laying the foundation for the strategic offensives of 1944 and 1945. Kursk symbolized the culmination of a transformative period on the Eastern Front. The Red Army, once on the defensive, had seized initiative, operational mastery, and the capacity to dictate the pace of war, fundamentally altering the trajectory of World War II. The aftermath of the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943 solidified the irreversible shift in strategic momentum on the Eastern Front. German forces, battered, depleted, and forced into defensive postures, could no longer launch major offensives with the operational freedom they had enjoyed in the early years of the war. Conversely, the Red Army, having successfully absorbed, blunted, and then counterattacked during one of history's largest armored engagements, now held the initiative. The implications were profound, both militarily and psychologically, as the Soviets transitioned from defending their territory to shaping the operational pace across vast sectors of Eastern Europe. Following Kursk, the Red Army launched a series of coordinated offensives to capitalize on the weakening of German forces. In Ukraine, Soviet armies advanced methodically, retaking key cities and infrastructure while applying continuous pressure on German defensive lines. Each advance demonstrated a mastery of combined arms tactics. Artillery barges softened enemy positions, mechanized formations exploited breaches, and infantry secured urban centers and supply routes. This operational fluidity contrasted sharply with the German response, which, constrained by attrition, limited reserves, and overextended supply lines, could only attempt localized counterattacks without strategic cohesion. Logistics continued to play a decisive role in shaping outcomes. The Soviets, leveraging the industrial relocation beyond the Urals and the steady flow of Lend-Lease supplies from the Allies, maintained operational tempo even during winter months. Tanks, artillery, trucks, and ammunition could be deployed rapidly, enabling sustained offensives that German forces increasingly struggled to match. German logistical difficulties, particularly the inability to replace destroyed armored units or replenish frontline supplies, meant that even well-trained units were vulnerable to the combined weight of Soviet artillery, mechanized, and infantry operations. The strategic advantage gained through industrial capacity became as decisive as battlefield tactics. The psychological impact of Kursk and subsequent Soviet operations cannot be understated. German soldiers, having witnessed the repeated failure of blitzkrieg tactics and the resilience of the Red Army, faced declining morale. The aura of Wehrmacht invincibility, carefully cultivated through early victories, was shattered. Commanders were increasingly aware that Hitler's insistence on holding territory at all costs had led to unsustainable attrition. Desertions and reduced combat effectiveness became more common, while hesitation in offensive operations reflected the awareness that overextension could result in encirclement, just as had occurred at Stalingrad. Soviet forces, conversely, were emboldened. Troops who had survived Stalingrad, Moscow, and Kursk carried not only combat experience but a growing confidence in the operational doctrine that emphasized depth, coordination, and strategic patience. High command could now plan operations weeks in advance, integrating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support into coherent campaigns designed to exploit enemy weaknesses while minimizing unnecessary losses. This operational maturity allowed the Soviets to conduct multiple simultaneous offensives across different sectors, overwhelming the Germans and forcing them to react on unfavorable terms. Strategically, the success at Kursk allowed the Red Army to initiate what would become a relentless westward push. Ukrainian territories were liberated, and German defensive lines were increasingly fragmented. Each Soviet advance forced the Wehrmacht to shorten fronts, redistribute exhausted units, and abandon fortified positions, often under continuous artillery and aerial bombardment. By systematically regaining territory, the Soviets not only inflicted material losses on German forces but also reshaped the strategic geography of the Eastern Front, creating corridors for subsequent offensives and limiting the operational options of the enemy. The battle also marked the maturation of Soviet operational art. The combination of intelligence, planning, coordination, and execution reflected lessons learned over 2 years of bitter warfare. Reconnaissance allowed precise positioning of forces, while reserves in depth enabled decisive counterattacks. Logistics ensured sustained operational tempo, and industrial output allowed for the replacement of losses without halting momentum. The Red Army's ability to integrate these elements into large-scale campaigns had evolved far beyond the defensive improvisations of 1941 to 42, signifying a transformation into a strategic force capable of dictating the course of the war. For Germany, the consequences were severe and immediate. The failure of Operation Citadel, coupled with the depletion of elite panzer divisions and experienced officers, meant that future offensive operations would be constrained by both manpower and material shortages. Defensive operations increasingly relied on static positions, fortifications, and reactive measures, reducing flexibility and increasing vulnerability to Soviet maneuver and concentration of force. Hitler's insistence on ideological imperatives over operational pragmatism further exacerbated these vulnerabilities, resulting in a growing gap between strategic objectives and battlefield realities. By the end of 1943, it was clear that the Eastern Front had undergone a fundamental shift. The Soviets had seized the initiative, transitioning from a reactive, survival-focused force to an offensive, strategically capable army capable of dictating engagements. German forces, weakened by Stalingrad, Kursk, and ongoing attrition, were forced into defensive operations, unable to regain the momentum necessary to challenge Soviet advances. The operational and psychological balance had decisively tipped, setting the stage for continued Soviet offensives that would ultimately drive the Wehrmacht back to Berlin and shape the final phase of World War II in Europe. The story of Kursk and its aftermath serves as both a military and historical lesson. Strategic preparation, operational depth, industrial capacity, and the psychological resilience of troops can fundamentally alter the course of a conflict. From the freezing streets of Stalingrad to the minefields and fortified belts of Kursk, the Red Army's evolution reflects a deliberate, patient, and adaptive approach that overcame initial setbacks, absorbed devastating losses, and transformed the initiative on the Eastern Front. The decisive victories of 1943 were not the result of chance but of learning, preparation, and the ability to turn experience into operational mastery.